This is the first time I've been asked to speak for such a long period of time. So, trying to think about how do I talk about something that I can talk about all day long, that yet make it interesting enough for, I think, someone who's not eating, sleeping, and breathing this subject matter. So we're going to have two completely separate talks today. So the first talk is, as you can see, it's going to be about, the talk I think is more interesting than the title, but we'll get to that. The second talk is actually more about healthcare cost containment, which I think for everybody in this room, and hopefully everybody in this country, should be something that's near top of mind and priority. And I was, when I was hanging out with Ed a little bit this morning, I realized that I have a great intermission story for all of you, because I've had like some of the most ridiculous dental stuff happen to me. Like there are stories I can tell at parties that just make everybody stop. And so I think I'll get a good laugh out of you guys at the midway point of this discussion. So as Ed said, I came to this very reluctantly, actually trained as a surgeon, surgical oncologist. I don't think I took a single course in nutrition at Stanford in medical school. My interest in nutrition was really primarily through the lens of sports. Growing up, I was a boxer, but then later got into swimming and then became obsessed with marathon swimming. So I was always hyper-fixated on nutrition, but kind of, embarrassed to say I wasn't really going to primary sources. I was just sort of, I guess following what was viewed as conventional nutrition for athletes, which is lots of carbs, lots of carbs, lots of carbs. That didn't do well for me. And as Ed alluded to, I, through a series of, pretty extreme nutritional experiments, arrived at something that definitely worked for me, as far as not just being less not thin, but more importantly, not being pre-diabetic and reducing my risk of heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, cancer, all the metabolic diseases. But it was through this process that I actually realized that this problem might be about much more than just me. I had largely viewed this as just my own little quirk, like, well, obviously the conventional wisdom and the food pyramid don't work for me, but it probably works for everybody else. And then I read a book by Gary Taubes called Good Calories, Bad Calories. Have any of you read that book? There's an airplane reading version of it called Why We Get Fat. Maybe some of you have read that. And if not, I think I'd really recommend it. If what we talk about today resonates with you, I would certainly recommend looking at that. So after I read Good Calories, Bad Calories, that was kind of the oh my moment. And actually much of the content of this talk comes from the research that Gary did. Gary spent 7 years researching that book, which is a 550-page book that the publisher pared down from an 1,100-page book. It's certainly the most thorough exploration of the entire history of the science and the politics of nutrition in the United States post-World War II. But nevertheless, when I read that book, I realized that there was something much bigger going on. That this was a structural problem. This wasn't just that Peter's kind of an outlier for whom the conventional wisdom doesn't apply. And so I reached out to Gary in early 2011 and via email, and he responded right away and said, let's get together at some point. And basically, I got on the next flight up to Berkeley, and we met at a cafe and said, I said, look, Gary, I had a list of questions. There were, I think it was 20 or 21 pages of questions I'd accumulated over the years. And anybody here who's met Gary will appreciate immediately the sort of significance of this comment. So I sit down with him, and I get 2 pages into it, and he just goes, dude, I'm just a burnt-out journalist, man. Like, no more questions. And he said, but in all seriousness, I think that, there is something that could be done about this. But it would require a complete scientific revolution. It would require a complete paradigm shift in science. In other words, this isn't just a political issue. This isn't just a social campaign. Those things matter. They're necessary. But at the core of this is basically a revisit of science. It's the scientific underpinning that formed our dietary guidelines, of which we're going to talk about one of them now. That needs to be readdressed. So, I give this talk. And I won't lie to you, I have a bias here. I have a very strong bias. My strong bias, which I'll just assert openly, is that the current conventional wisdom is categorically false. Now, would I take that to the bank? Would I say that based on my bias, we should rewrite dietary guidelines today? The answer is no, because I think we can't afford to make another mistake. You don't get so many, each time you make one of these missteps, you kill thousands of people. So before we kill any more people, I think we owe it to ourselves as a society to do what we should have done 40 years ago, which is get the science right. So with that, I would say there are really two pillars of scientific wisdom that form the entire bedrock and foundation of everything most people believe about nutrition. And even though you may never have thought of these this way, I'm going to state them for you now, and I will posit that most of what you believe about nutrition, most of what you are told about nutrition, most of what you are marketed to about nutrition comes down to one of these two things. The first is that with respect to fat balance, all calories are created equal. Stated another way, some people call it calories in, calories out. Some people call it a calorie is a calorie. I think those are actually technically inaccurate ways to say it. So for an audience like you guys, I'd rather be more technical. The technical piece of foundational wisdom is that the metabolic impact of calories on our body's ability to store and burn fat is independent of where the calorie comes from. Now, you may say, oh, I've never heard that before, but you sort of have, right? It's why we have 100-calorie snack packs of garbage, because, hey, it's just 100 calories. It's why Coca-Cola tells you it's okay to drink Coca-Cola, because it's just calories. Just have them in moderation. Don't have 10 Cokes, but you can certainly have 2 Cokes. Because if all calories exert the same metabolic effect, technically 100 calories of broccoli and 100 calories of Coca-Cola, while nobody would dispute that the 100 calories of broccoli may have more nutritional value, they certainly should have the exact same impact on your body's ability to regulate fat tissue. So that's pillar number one, and I agree that that's categorically false. We're not going to talk about that one today, though. The second one is that saturated fat causes heart disease. Now, be honest. How many of you believe saturated fat causes heart disease? And I'm hoping everybody's hand goes up, or else I'm wasting my time here today. If nobody puts their hand up, I can leave, right? How many people think saturated fat causes heart disease? Good. Okay, you should feel that way because you've been force-fed that for as long as you've been alive, for most of you, and certainly as long as you can remember. Okay, I'm going to challenge that one today. Now, again, I want to be really clear. This is not something I could take to the Supreme Court and overturn the AHA and the ACC, okay? What I'm trying to do is make the case that we need to revisit that question, because today that question, in the eyes of the highest powers, is case closed. And it's been case closed since 1977. Okay, so let's talk about the recommendations. So every 5 years, the United States Department of Agriculture, through the Dietary Guidelines Committee, and this has been going on since 1980, so 80, 85, 90, et cetera, releases dietary guidelines, and they're in the process right now of releasing the 2015 guidelines, but the most recent guidelines are here, and I'll let you read them. So the part that I've highlighted here, right, in order to reduce the population's burden from cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and their risk factors, the preponderance of the evidence indicates beneficial health effects are associated with several changes in consumption of dietary fats and cholesterol. This includes limiting saturated fatty acid intake to less than 7% of total calories. It is worth noting that this recommendation has been going down every year. So the original guidelines called for a recommendation below 13%, 11%, 9%, 7%. A more recent guideline, which I'll share with you in a moment, is now requesting that we go below 5% on saturated fat. Those are bold statements. I mean, you'd really want to believe that the evidence is like, it's got to be rock solid, right? Okay, so about a little less than a year ago, in about November of last year, the American Heart Association, the American College of Cardiology, released their guidelines on lifestyle changes for reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, they give each type of recommendation a level of strength. The highest you can get is a grade A. I wanted to quote this directly. A grade A means strong, which means there is a high certainty on the evidence that the net benefit of this recommendation is substantial. The net benefit is defined as a benefit outweighing the risk and harm. And so 2 of the 3 things that were given strong A ratings were aim for a dietary pattern that achieves 5 to 6% of calories from saturated fat and reduce the percent of calories from saturated fat. First of all, those aren't even independent vectors, so it's sort of, as a math guy, that sort of irks me that those are highly overlapping. But nevertheless, the point is clear. We're going to go one better than the DAG. We've got to get saturated fat down to 5 to 6%, and this is the highest possible recommendation we can make, right? We think it's important to wash your hands before surgery. Yes, that's strong. We think it's important to give the right antibiotic to somebody who's dying. Yes, that's strong. And we think this is just as strong. Okay, so let's look at the evidence. Well, when the FAO and World Health Organization wrote a background paper in 2009 examining all of the information, they said the available evidence from cohort and randomized controlled trials is unsatisfactory and unreliable to make judgment about and substantiate the effects of dietary fat on the risk of coronary heart disease. A group from Oakland Children's Hospital under Ron Krause, who's sort of one of, I guess, sort of the three biggest thought leaders on cardiovascular disease, wrote a meta-analysis in 2010 that said a meta-analysis of prospective epidemiologic studies shows that there is no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with an increased risk of coronary heart disease or cerebrovascular disease. And just recently, you may have all seen this actually in the New York Times, this came out in the spring, a very large meta-analysis. In fact, this looked at 49 observational trials with about 500,000 subjects in them and about 27 randomized control trials with more than 100,000 patients. Said current evidence does not clearly support cardiovascular guidelines that encourage high consumption of polyunsaturated fatty acids and low consumption of total saturated fats. In fact, I went back and reread the paper 2 days ago just to refresh my memory. Everybody understand how a relative risk ratio works, what those numbers mean? Like if someone says the relative risk ratio of this is 1.05 with a confidence interval, is it worth me spending a second on what that means, or does everybody know that? Spend the second. Okay. So a relative risk ratio of 1.05 means there is a 5% increase in risk. If it was 1.10, that would be a 10% increase in risk. The confidence interval tells you we are 95% sure that it is between blah and blah. And if that confidence interval overlaps with the number 1, it means it's not actually significant. It's probably chance, right? So I'm just going to read you the relative risk because they did this with RCTs. They combined basically every RCT and every epidemiologic study. We're going to talk later about why I think epidemiologic studies are not particularly valuable in this regard, and it actually has to do with something Gary said at the outset about time course and severity of disease. But nevertheless, for saturated fat, the relative risk was 1.03. 3% relative risk increase, but the confidence interval was 0.98 to 1.07, so it was not statistically significant, didn't matter. For monounsaturated fats, olive oil, right, it was 1.00. No increase, no decrease in risk, but it also wasn't significant because it was 0.91 to 1.11. For omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, these are the polyunsaturated fats that are primarily found in marine products, so you're going to get this in your fish oils, that sort of thing. That was the only one that showed a reduction of risk, 0.87, so a 13% reduction in risk, and it was 0.78 to 0.97 was the confidence interval, meaning it was legitimately below 1. And I won't get into the others, but N6 or omega-6, the type of polyunsaturated fat found in things like nuts and things like that, actually turned out to be elevated. It was 1.16, and it was significant. So in other words, we're told today, don't eat saturated fat, eat poly and monounsaturated fat, and the most expansive review of the literature says there's actually no evidence to support that. Okay. So I could stop the talk right here, right? But that's not, the question you're asking is, well, you've just created some dissonance, right? I mean, you're telling me that there's a whole bunch of recommendations that are emphatic in what they're saying, and yet you're showing me, at the very least, conflicting evidence, if not outright contradictory evidence. So you know there's got to be a good story behind this. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. So let's start with the story. In 1951, a nutritionist from the University of Minnesota named Ansel Keys became very interested in a new technology that had just effectively come online, which was a way to measure cholesterol in the blood. So prior to this, we certainly knew that cholesterol existed in the human body. Cholesterol is involved in the formation of every cell in the body. Not having cholesterol in your body, just to be really clear, is incompatible with life. So there are really rare, fortunately very rare genetic disorders that result in failure to metabolize cholesterol properly. These are uniformly fatal, often in utero. So no cholesterol, no life. Let's just get that on the table to begin with. But the question that was really of interest at the time was, what about all this cholesterol in the blood? What do we know about that? And so at the time, there was a way that you could draw somebody's blood, do a chemical assay where you break down the cells after spinning them, and isolate the total amount of cholesterol in the blood. Now, I want to be really clear about something. Cholesterol does not travel through the blood willy-nilly, right? Because blood is like water, and cholesterol is like fat, basically. It's much more complicated, but it's what we call hydrophobic, and so you can't put those two together. They have to be buffered by something and carried by something. So they're carried by things called lipoproteins. So you may have not ever heard of a lipoprotein, but you've all heard of LDL and HDL. Well, what does that stand for? LDL stands for low density lipoprotein. HDL stands for high density lipoprotein. So it's really these lipoproteins that carry everything. But back in this day, they had no clue about any of that stuff. All they knew was there were a bunch of proteins that obviously carried this stuff around. We can break them all down and measure the total content of the cholesterol. So even today, when you go to your doctor and you get a cholesterol panel, you'll notice they do report total cholesterol. And that was the only thing that Ansel Keys could measure in 1951. So Ansel, along with his wife, Margaret, went to Italy, and they assessed cholesterol and fat content of the diet, of workers there within the diet, and they came to a couple of observations. They noticed, hey, the people who are eating more fat and cholesterol, which were the wealthy people, are getting more heart disease. The people who are eating less fat and less cholesterol, the workers, are getting less heart disease. We call that an observation, and they found that very interesting. Well, this obviously sparked what became sort of the dominant theology of the 50s and 60s, which was a series of studies, what are called ecologic studies, that Ansel Keys undertook. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, not because I particularly like doing so. In fact, it kind of annoys me to have to talk about this, but because I think it's so important to understand the story, because it is kind of compelling. Now, what Ansel Keys did was he took a look, and this was published over several years. So the very first one was published in 1957. The final one, I believe, was published in 1970. So I'm going to explain the methodology. The methodology was, we're going to look at every country in the world for which there are data for two things. One is mortality. We have to know how people die. The second thing we need to know is food availability. How much food is produced per capita, and of what type? So there were 22 countries in the world that met that criteria. Most countries, obviously, you couldn't get both of those. Now, food availability data in and of itself is pretty weak, right? It just says how much food is available in a given country divided by the total number of people. It doesn't actually tell you what they're eating. I mean, today, epidemiologists are more sophisticated, though it's still a far cry from knowing what's actually taking place, because they subtract out food waste from that. And so in theory, you could say, well, this much is created, this much is imported, exported, this much is thrown away. You put the delta of those together and normalize that, you'd have a slightly more accurate assessment of that. But back in the day, this was just food production. The second problem is mortality data. Now, has anybody here ever filled out a death certificate? So I've had to fill out a bunch of these. In fact, this was the bane of every surgical resident, or medical resident for that matter's existence in residency, because filling out death certificates is cumbersome, it's tedious, and it doesn't allow you the flexibility to explain what the person really died of. You have to sort of come up with very nice, neat buckets. So sometimes it's obvious when a person is tragically hit by a car and killed. You can motor vehicle trauma, right? But many times it's not, right? Many times someone has diabetes and they get into the hospital because they have sepsis and you have to amputate their leg, and while they're there, they have a heart attack, and it's sort of like, did they die of heart disease or diabetes, or was it the sepsis? And maybe they actually had a pulmonary embolism because they actually stopped breathing pretty quick. So it gets very complicated. And we do a pretty good job of this in the US, probably not great. But if you actually go back and look at the records that Ansel Keys looked through, most countries were doing a horrible job of this. They weren't doing autopsies. So it's very hard to know when someone is found not awake in their bed in the morning, you just assume they died of what? I don't know. Heart disease, stroke, I don't know. So I say all this to sort of color the story a bit, to explain that the quality of this analysis wouldn't hold muster today, even amongst an 8th grader trying to do a science fair project. Like I mean, I'm not being facetious. It's literally that low. It's literally that poor in quality. But it, you know, admittedly, it was the best you could do at the time. Okay. Unfortunately, by the way, the original data have been destroyed, and so it is not possible to go back and repeat this analysis with these data, at least through the statistical analyses. Now, here are the data in their complete form. Each number on here represents a country. So there are the 22 countries for which both of those data sets were available. And on the x-axis, you see percentage of calories, percentage of total calories that come from fat. So you've got, you know, Japan over here is remarkable, right? Less than 10% of their total calories come from dietary fat. And of course, you've got the good old US of A up here, where over 40% of our calories came from fat. And on the y-axis, you have cardiac mortality, meaning out of every, and I think it's done on every 10,000, out of every 10,000 deaths in this country, how many are attributed to heart disease? Again, not, or it's per thousand maybe. No, I think it's per 10,000 on this axis. It's per thousand over here. So in other words, this says, based on what the death certificate said, how many of these people are dying of heart disease and how much fat are they eating? So let's look at the data. I think there's a pattern there, right? I mean, I think it's safe to say the more fat in your diet, the more likely you are to die of heart disease. The less fat in your diet, the less likely you are to die of heart disease. Now, Ansel Keys never published the analysis this way, and he's been accused many times over of cherry-picking the data and only picking the best 7 that made that curve. And hence, this was referred to as initially the 5-country study, and ultimately in 1970, the 7-country study. So the 7-country study is this line here. And admittedly, it looks a heck of a lot better when you pick the best ones on the line. But in fairness to Ansel Keys, the correlation, though not as strong, still existed here. Okay, so let's talk about that. 2 things that most people don't know. The first I've already shared with you, which is all of the methodologic stuff. The second thing most people don't know is whether you looked at the entire population or a subset of it, mortality for heart disease turned out to be higher the more fat you ate. Mortality for every other disease known to mankind turned out to be lower. Meaning, the more fat you ate, the less likely you were to die of cancer. The less likely you were to die of an infectious disease. The less likely you were to die of pick your other complication. Now, you could also argue that, well, if heart disease is prevalent enough, it becomes an X1 minus X problem. Fair enough. The other thing I think worth noting here is, if you guys had John Ioannidis here a year ago, you guys got schooled in this, so it really only requires sort of a 30-second explanation is, does everybody understand what we mean by correlation? And everybody hears the term correlation does not apply causation, but I think it's worth spending like a minute on that. So a correlation is a mathematical way to describe a relationship. It means that 2 variables, and you can have multivariate correlation, but at the simplest level, 2 things move together. Okay, so height and age would be correlated, right? As we age, we tend to get taller. So if we plotted age of the US population, height of the US population, we'd see a very strong correlation. But it doesn't imply that there's a cause. So I'll give you like my favorite glib example, which is not mine, by the way. I'm blanking on the, I did hear somebody tell this once, and I thought it was funny. If you plotted on the x-axis shoe size, and on the y-axis reading comprehension, you'd have a very strong correlation. A shockingly strong, much stronger than this, by the way. Is there anybody in this room who honestly thinks that your shoe size determines your reading comprehension? You all dismissed it outright as idiotic. Now you may not know why, but I'm going to tell you why in a second. But your logical process, he said, obviously the guy with bigger feet doesn't imply he's a better reader. But it is a very strong correlation. The problem is there's a confounder. And that's the problem with epidemiology. It's this little dirty thing called confounders. So what's the confounder of shoe size? Age. It's age. Shoe size is an amazing proxy for age. And age is certainly correlated with reading comprehension through, by the way, I might add, another confounder. Age in and of itself does not tell you anything about reading comprehension. But age is a proxy for education. The longer you've lived, the more you should be educated. Now think about that for a moment, right? So it's a simple, silly, glib example, but it's important to illustrate how complicated epidemiology can be. Shoe size, reading comprehension, very strong correlation. But the jugular issue is why? It's probably because the bigger your shoe size, the older you are. The older you are, the more you've been to school. The more you've been to school, the better you read. If you don't understand everything in that link, you can very quickly come to an erroneous decision about the A and the B statement, or the alpha and the omega statement. And what I'm about to argue here is that that's exactly what happened here. I have no doubt that the more fat that was in somebody's diet, the more likely they were to die of heart disease, notwithstanding all the other limitations. Take away all the death certificate stuff. There is no way that I could imagine that more people in the United States didn't die of heart disease than in Japan, and that they weren't eating a hell of a lot more fat. The question is that the cause? Or is that simply a confounder? Was there something else that the Americans were eating more of, or the Japanese were eating less of? Now, any of you been to Japan? I mean, anybody been to Japan like 30 years ago? Not today? Right. How different is their diet from ours? Significant, right. Today it's becoming tragically less different from ours. The same is true with China. The same is true with many parts of the world. So to suggest that there's one thing that made this difference, absent all others, is a little bit naive. So that's sort of, okay. So in 1952, this was prior to these studies, by the way, but just after the observation, Ancel Keys came back and presented his hypothesis at the World Health Organization meeting in Amsterdam and said that fatty diet raised serum cholesterol, caused atherosclerosis, and myocardial infarction. Now, interesting to note, he was originally ridiculed for that. So in the early 1950s, the cardiology community thought this was kind of silly. Right? It was a new idea. It seemed really silly. But they were more convinced by the graphs that I showed you earlier. So much so that by 1961, the American Heart Association released a 4-page report that now included Keys' conclusions, that the best scientific evidence of the time strongly suggests that Americans would reduce their risk of heart disease by reducing the fats in their diet and replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. Now, I have a copy of this in my office. There are a handful of copies of Time magazine I'd like to have framed to sort of remind me of how we got here, and this is one of them. In 1961, Keys was on the cover of Time magazine, and in this he recommended that the ideal heart-healthy diet should be almost 70% carbohydrate and only 15% fat. Now remember, at the time, Americans were consuming about 42% of their calories from fat. This is a big change, which you'd want to believe has big science supporting it. Okay, so let's talk about the competing philosophies. Now you remember I alluded at the beginning of the talk to sort of a sea change that really kicked off. There was something that's significant that happened in 1977. So what was it? It was something called the final report, or what's called the Dietary Goals for the United States, was released. This is more commonly referred to as the McGovern Committee. The formal name for the committee was the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Health and Human Needs. This was a committee that was formed in 1968. It was originally formed to study malnutrition in the South. However, by the early 1970s, as this debate was heating up, their focus shifted from malnutrition to the role of fat and heart disease. Now, by 1977, Congress became very impatient and insisted that a report be issued. And I just want to share with you sort of two polarizing views, or two opposite views on that panel. The first by the chair of the panel, which was George McGovern, who argued when the scientists pushed back, many of the scientists pushed back in 1977 and said, we do not have sufficient evidence to make a recommendation one way or the other. And McGovern, who was, of course, feeling pressure from Congress, who were basically saying, you need to issue a report now, this thing's been going on for 9 years, enough is enough, said, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in. Now, on the opposing side of that was Philip Handler, the president of the National Academy of Science. He said, what right has the federal government to propose that the American people conduct a vast nutritional experiment with themselves as subjects on the strength of so little evidence? So you know how the story ended. Okay, let's go through it again in some more detail. So let's talk a little bit about selection bias. Ansel Keys, by the late 1950s, was the dominant figure in this space. Now, you know, I never got to meet Ansel Keys. He died sort of not that long ago, probably 2005 if I recall, maybe 2000. But I've spoken with many people who have met him, who have interviewed him. Apparently a very charismatic, charming, good-looking guy. You know, there's something to be said for a story being told by someone who fits that description, right? It's easier to hear it. And so, you know, by the late 1950s, as I said, he really became the de facto authority on this. And he said, look, each new research adds detail, reduces areas of uncertainty, and so far provides further reasons to believe. This was in a 1957 publication of that first 5-country study. But of course, there's so many examples that ran counter to that it became so, you know, it became sort of the cult of ignoring those. Now, we're going to talk in great detail about the Framingham Heart Study later on, so don't worry if you don't know what that is, but I'll just suggest to you that there were some positive data in that study. The Framingham Heart Study found a link between cholesterol level in the blood and heart disease. But there were also lots of negative data. In women over 50, cholesterol had no predictive value of heart disease. Furthermore, unpublished negative data showed that in Framingham, they compared the diets of men whose cholesterol was over 300, that's a pretty high level, 300 milligrams per deciliter, to the diets of men in the bottom 5%, 170 milligrams per deciliter. And it actually found no relationship between the highest and the lowest amount of cholesterol in people's blood and how much fat and cholesterol they ate. That's pretty interesting. But that didn't consider, that wasn't part of the story. And the authors noted that there is considerable range of serum cholesterol within the Framingham study group. Something explains this inter-individual variation, but it is not the diet as measured here. Now again, think about it. What's going on in 1968? The diet heart hypothesis says you eat fat, you get heart disease. There's a nuance I'll just point out because it's worth mentioning. So the difference between cholesterol and fat is significant, right? So eating cholesterol is not the same as eating fat. Even Ansel Keys himself, by the way, felt that eating cholesterol did not raise cholesterol. And that is correct. That's something I would take to the bank tomorrow, right? So the cholesterol that we eat, like that which is in eggs and shellfish and stuff, doesn't really even make it into our system because of a chemical reason. It has something called a esterified side chain on it, and we can't absorb sterols with side chains on them. So most of the cholesterol you eat comes right out of your body immediately. And even Ansel Keys acknowledged that back in the day. But nevertheless, at the time, a very interesting question was, does the amount of cholesterol and or fat that we eat raise our serum cholesterol, which we think is causing heart disease? But there was lots of other epidemiologic evidence that countered the original observation by Keys. Remember, Keys had a very specific criteria for looking at it, but when you looked at other subpopulations, not countries, because he was doing this at a country level, but when you looked at Benedictine and Trappist monks, Navajo Indians, the Irish immigrants to Boston, the Swiss alpine farmers, the Maasai, other African pastoralites, it found no association between saturated fat consumption and heart disease. In other words, there were countless counterexamples, even to the epidemiology. But amazingly, Keys rejected them as having no relevance to the diet, cholesterol, coronary heart disease relationships in other populations. I mean, it's another way of doing something that I think we all tend to do anyway, and you know, that's sort of why you want to have people around you to keep you honest, which is when you see data that counter your belief, you reject it. So let's revisit selection bias. So in 1957, Oglesby, Paul, and his colleagues at the University of Chicago, conducted a study. This was a non-intervention study, a purely observational study of 5,400 male employees of the Western Electric Company. Now, they spent their time focusing on the 15% of men who self-reported eating the least amount of fat to the 15% of men who reported eating the highest amount of fat. So again, when you're doing epidemiology, sometimes you want to create the greatest signal, so you look at the most extremes on both ends. So for 4.5 years, with no intervention, they just prospectively followed the men who ate the most fat and the men who ate the least fat. And at the end of 4.5 years, they said, how many people have died of heart disease? And at the end of 4.5 years, 88 men in that cohort had died of heart disease. 14 of them were in the high-fat group, and 16 were in the low-fat group. Doesn't seem suggestive that eating a high-fat diet is causing heart disease. They returned 15 years later and followed up the observation. And it turned out to be the exact same. At 15 years, I'm sorry, yeah, it was 15 years. It might have been a little longer. I think it was 15 years. There was no difference. So the numbers got bigger, because obviously more time for people to die, but there was no difference between them. And so the authors concluded that the amount of saturated fatty acids in the diets was not significantly associated with the risk of death from coronary heart disease. Okay. By the way, I went back and looked at all these papers, because you kind of want to read, you don't just want to read the news clippings, you want to read the actual papers. So, you know, this is a quote directly from the paper that was published in JAMA in 1981. And they rationalized in the discussion section. Although most attempts to document the relationship of dietary cholesterol, saturated fatty acids, and polyunsaturated fatty acids to serum cholesterol concentration in persons who are eating freely have been unsuccessful, positive test results have been obtained in 4 investigations besides the Western Electric study. Well, first of all, the Western Electric study was not successful. It didn't show that. They rationalized further in the same paper. If viewed in isolation, the conclusions that can be drawn from a single epidemiologic study are limited. Within the context of the total literature, however, the present observations support the conclusions that the fat composition of the diet affects the level of serum cholesterol and the long-term risk from death from coronary heart disease in middle-aged American men. They may be talking about a paper I was not able to read. And the media pounced all over this. The Washington Post said, the new report strongly reinforces the view that a high-fat, high-cholesterol diet can clog arteries and cause heart disease. This obviously also reflects our complete lack of understanding of how atherosclerosis works. It has nothing to do with clogging arteries, but it sure sounds good, right? Eating fat, clogging arteries. And one of the authors in the New York Times noted that the message of these findings is that it is prudent to decrease the amount of saturated fats and cholesterol in your diet. Amazingly, over the next decade, as a bunch of other things unfolded, this talk is not told chronologically. I'm going to jump back and forth, so I'm following a thread of the Western Electric study, then we're going to come back. So keep the timeline in mind. By 1990, the denouement, the nail in the coffin, was when the AHA and the NHLBI co-authored a report called The Cholesterol Facts. And they included the Western Electric study as one of 7 epidemiologic studies showing the link between diet and coronary heart disease that have produced particularly impressive results in showing a correlation between saturated fatty acids and coronary heart disease, which is precisely what it did not do. Let's go back to the 70s. Let's talk about the state of the evidence. So remember, in 1970, so you had in 1961, the AHA releases the ad hoc committee, the 4-page report based on Ansel Keys' 1957 study. Now we go forward to 1970. Now this has really become, there's been a complete 180 in the AHA. The American Heart Association Committee now recommends a low saturated fat diet, less than 10% of calories, for every American, including infants, children, adolescents, lactating and pregnant women, and older persons. Remember, today, what are we down to? 7, according to the second from last, 5 to 6% on the last. So we're getting much more aggressive. Now, this wasn't lost on a handful of observers, right? There were a handful of people sort of sitting back in the peanut gallery saying, WTF, right? So Henry Blackburn wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine, two strikingly polar attitudes persist on this subject, with much talk from each and little listening between. Another author commented in the New England Journal of Medicine, it must still be admitted that the diet-heart relationship is an unproven hypothesis that needs more investigation. Now, of course, this was written 1 year after it was basically carved in stone with the dietary goals for Americans. So let's look at some clinical trials. So I just pull up these two because they're basically the exact same experiment and they show different results, and it's not clear which one's right? So in 1963, a group of Hungarian researchers reported that if you limited the consumption of fat in high-risk men to 1.5 ounces per day, that's a really small amount. That's like 45 grams of fat a day, total fat a day. There was some benefit in reducing the risk of heart disease. And about the same time, a British group was doing a slightly more controlled experiment because they looked at men, so that's a higher risk population, so they were looking at men who had already suffered an MI. And they did the same thing. They limited them to 1.5 ounces of fat per day. And actually, the group that had less fat had a higher risk of recurrent heart disease. So they reported a low-fat diet has no place in the treatment of myocardial infarction. So again, that doesn't sound to me like a settled science. You could make an argument from that. We have no idea what the answer is, but it certainly doesn't sound like a settled science. Perhaps one of the greatest tragedies in this entire story is this study. It's a tragedy for a couple of reasons. So in 1973, the Minnesota coronary study was initiated. This had 9,000 men and women. This was a very good study in that, again, I don't even know if it would be ethical to do this today, but at the time it was done in 6 mental institutions in Minnesota. So the reason that's of note is because you actually could control what the patient was eating. Right? So most of these studies are based on you telling me what you ate, which if I picked on one of you right now and said, tell me what you ate last Monday a week ago, like how well do you think you'd do? Yeah, pretty crappy. So you could make an argument that much of the scientific underpinning of this is pretty lousy. But the Minnesota Heart Study is interesting because it took 9,000 men and women across these 6 institutions over a period of 4.5 years, and they actually were fed the diets of the prescription. So the treatment arm for this was a 9% saturated fat intake. So they dramatically reduced the intake of saturated fat to 9%. In the control arm, they consumed 18% saturated fat. So both groups contained about the same amount of fat, but the treatment group said, we're going to take saturated fat down to near nothing. In the control arm, they just ate more mono and polyunsaturated fat. So they were eating about the same stuff. So that's actually pretty good in science when you can create a clean experiment where one group, basically you just change the one variable. The total cholesterol in the group on the low-fat diet over 4.5 years went from 207 to 175. So eating less fat did lower their cholesterol from 207 to 175. And in the treatment group, it went from that average of 207 to about 203. So very little change. But there was no difference at all after 4.5 years in heart disease or overall mortality. So I started by saying this was a real tragedy. Why? So you can see 269 deaths in the intervention group, 206 deaths in the control. That was not statistically significant, though it almost looks like more people were dying in the low-fat group. The tragedy of this is that this study, which completed in 1973, was not published until 1989. And when the principal investigator was asked why, his response was, we were disappointed in the way the results turned out. Now, to me, that's a great tragedy because that says that was a very important 16 years in the history of this debate. And one of the best studies that certainly from a control level was able to address some of these questions basically got, it was hiding in some guy's office in the University of Minnesota. I have often wondered, and again, I'm just asserting a bias here, I've often wondered how much of that had to do with the fact that Ansel Keys was also at the University of Minnesota, and this was in Minnesota. I don't know. I have no insight into that, but it's certainly, as a skeptic, that's sort of as the conspiracy theorist, I would argue that. Okay, so what was the tipping point? Well, I kind of already alluded to this. The tipping point really came in 1977 when Congress insisted to Senator McGovern that the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Health and Human Needs release its findings. And so they did. If you recall, you had Philip Handler and many others on the opposing side of this saying, we are not ready to issue guidelines. In fact, this is irresponsible behavior. And then you had a political system that said, we better know something. And I can relate to both of those, right? I spend most of my time these days, if I'm not fundraising, I'm trying to educate policymakers about the need to pay attention to this problem. And again, I think it's understandable that they operate through a lens of just tell me the best thing I can do right now, right? I accept that the information may be incomplete, but certainly there must be something to do that is the best we can do now. So again, I don't think this is nefarious. I think it's easy to demonize McGovern, and there may be things to demonize him for, but I don't think this is one. I think the desire to get an answer is a legitimate and understandable need to sort of prevent death, but it has an unintended consequence. And so the two recommendations put forth by the committee was to increase carbohydrate consumption to 55 to 60% of calories and to reduce fat consumption to 30% of calories. Now, the reason you have to increase your consumption of carbohydrates is if you're taking away fat, you have to put something back in. Now, interestingly, and again, it's almost like each slide of this talk is a separate book, right? So there's an entire series of books just on this and the politics behind it. But one of the interesting things was another recommendation they had that really got buried was that Americans limit their consumption of sugar. It turned out that the lobbying forces that existed of the day made it pretty clear that that one was going to sort of get swept aside. And Gary Taubes, who's my co-founder at NUSI, actually went back and interviewed the person who was sort of like the I don't know what the exact term is for the person, but the person who basically wrote the report. You know, it's sort of a junior person that would have been in McGovern's office, the staff person who would have done all the heavy lifting. And he interviewed this person, and he said at the day of the hearing, when they all sort of parted ways, someone from the sugar industry came up to him and said, you know, you guys just put these recommendations out there, and what you implied or what you wanted to happen was that eat more carbohydrates means eat more fruits and vegetables. But he goes, in fact, what you guys just did was you opened up a Pandora's box for an entirely new culture of food, an entirely new engineered food product, which, of course, many of you know how that will go. So there was certainly debate at the time about whether this was the right thing to do, but I want to share with you what's called the fallback position, or the precautionary principle. So Mark Hegsted, who was then at Harvard University and was a member of this committee, said the question to be asked is not why should we change our diet, but why not? There are no risks that can be identified, and important benefits can be expected. His argument being, look, I admit we might not know for certain that fat is causing heart disease, but could there possibly be any harm from taking it out of our diet? Well, it depends what you substitute in, doesn't it? So let's look at the cohort studies. Okay, now we're going to have a little discussion about Framingham, which is pretty interesting. This is where my personal favorite part of the story is this part, because this is like how lipidology 101 got run amok. So in the early 1970s, the NIH became very interested in understanding more about this cholesterol heart disease business. And remember at the time, you had Ansel Keys doing all this thing on total cholesterol level, right? But it became clear through some studies that the techniques had been developed to look at what's called gel electrophoresis. You could start to separate out those proteins that carry cholesterol. And it became clear that they were different densities. In particular, they saw one that was of low density, what we now call LDL. And they believed that that, in particular, was the critical part of cholesterol that may be responsible for heart disease. So in what was at the time unprecedented, the NIH funded a very large cohort study to look at the specific question of these fractions of cholesterol. In other words, could we do better at predicting heart disease by understanding elevations in certain subsets or subclasses of cholesterol? So to do this, they did what's called a cohort study. So they looked at 5 cohorts. Now, Framingham is the one you've probably all heard of, the Framingham study, right? So everyone's heard of Framingham. But there were 4 others. So there was Framingham, there was Albany, Honolulu, Puerto Rico, San Francisco. And there were 2 separate studies that were done. The first one was done looking at 900 patients in those 5 cohorts who had a coronary event, so major adverse coronary event, and 900 matched controls from their cohort. So you now had 1,800 people. Half of them have had a coronary event, half of them have not, across these 5 cohorts. And we studied the blood of all of them. Now, at the time, you couldn't actually measure LDL cholesterol. You could measure total cholesterol. You could measure something that they weren't interested in called high-density lipoprotein, HDL cholesterol. And you could measure triglyceride. And a very clever formula links those. It turns out total cholesterol is approximated by all the high-density cholesterol, all the low-density cholesterol, and all the very low-density cholesterol. Now, high-density, so you're trying to solve for the LDL one. So it's sort of like an, A equals B plus C plus D. If you can get 3 of those, you're going to get the 4th using simple algebra. Here's the algebra. We can measure total cholesterol. Remember, Ansel Keys even knew how to do that 10, 15 years earlier. They had figured out how to measure high-density HDL cholesterol. You could measure triglyceride, which it turned out is a pretty good proxy for VLDL if you divide it by 5. It's about 20%. A simple rearranging of the equation allows you to calculate, not measure, calculate LDL cholesterol. And so the investigators set out to do that. So they measured total cholesterol, triglyceride, and HDL cholesterol in all of these people. They didn't really care about any of those things because they calculated LDL. Then what they did was they took those results and in a prospective Framingham cohort of, I want to say 1,800 people. I have to check my notes here. 2,000 people. They did a predictive observational study going forward in Framingham using those metrics. So in other words, you test it here, you validate it here. And here's what they found. Elevated level of LDL cholesterol was a marginal factor for risk. It turned out that a low HDL was the single greatest predictor of cardiovascular risk in men and women of every single age, from 30 to 80 years old. And it turned out that elevated triglyceride, which almost always goes hands in hand with low HDL. If your HDL is high, your trigs are usually low. If your trigs are high, your HDL is always low. It turned out that elevated triglyceride was almost equally strong in predicting cardiovascular risk in all but one subgroup, and I believe it was women under 50. It had no predictive bearing or something like that. But the point is you had low HDL, high triglyceride being far and away the better predictors of heart disease risk, and LDL being elevated only turned out to have some reliability for men and women over 50, and even there it was about a quarter as strong as the HDL and LDL story. 2 caveats worth mentioning. It is well documented, well known, nobody will argue this. Saturated fat raises HDL. Carbohydrates lower it. Back when I was a fat guy, my HDL, when I was a carbivore, when I was a 70% carb loading swimmer guy, my HDL was like 31, which actually qualified me as having metabolic syndrome. I was blown away over the next 2 years as I continued to tweak my diet, how much I could manipulate my HDL cholesterol. I could literally get it, at one point I got it as high as 85. And again, this is not pharmacologic, this is just through dietary intervention, and it really held true to this point, right? So, many of you are saying, well, wait a minute, if all this was published in 1977, why didn't this impact the story? Well, the authors of that paper concluded things that raise HDL should be considered to reduce the risk of heart disease. So this is 1977. This story went effectively ignored and unnoticed until the mid-90s. And again, I think it's maybe, now that I think about it, this may be the greatest tragedy. I think the Minnesota Heart Study becomes the second greatest. So why is that? Well, you see, at the time, prior to the publication of this, the NIH had already launched 2 enormous studies investigating the role of LDL cholesterol in heart disease. These studies were huge. In yesterday's dollars, these were $250 million studies. In today's dollars, these were over $500 million in 2 studies that went forward. So this story got completely ignored. In fact, there's a great interview with the lead author on that paper, Gordon, explaining how he took these findings to the NIH after the publication of the Framingham study and presented this to the group, and they basically looked at him as though this was completely irrelevant, uninteresting, and why are you telling us this? The guy that resurrected this was a guy who's actually still alive today named Jerry Reaven at Stanford, and in the mid-90s he observed something, which was there's a cluster of metabolic findings that seem to predict heart disease, diabetes, stroke, cancer, Alzheimer's disease far better than anything else. And they are obviously truncal obesity, so waist, and he had cutoffs, so for men it was more than 40 inches, for women more than 36 inches, elevated blood pressure, elevated glucose, fasting glucose elevation. What are the other 2? Anybody know? Low HDL, high triglyceride. No mention of LDL. That syndrome, which was referred to as Syndrome X, is now referred to as metabolic syndrome. You've all heard of it. Metabolic syndrome is you have 3 of those 5, your risk of the metabolic diseases just went through the roof. So it really wasn't until Reaven came back and looked at this that it became clear that the story always really should have been about HDL and triglycerides. The LDL story is, while certainly more nuanced than I'm going to be able to get into today, was really the second tier story. There was a little bit of cognitive dissonance here too. I think it was very hard for people who had been hardwired to believe cholesterol is bad to imagine that there could be a subfraction of cholesterol that is not bad. Because at the end of the day, high density cholesterol is just another type of lipoprotein that's carrying the same cholesterol. The thought that that could somehow be good just created sort of a cognitive dissonant moment in people, and I think largely resulted in the dismissal of this thesis. Okay, so let's go back to the 2 studies that were being launched while the Framingham thing was going on. So the first was Mr. Fit. This was a study that, as you can see, $115 million back in the 1970s. In today's dollars, this is about $250 million study. This was a 7-year study that looked at, it's been a while since I've read this one, so I'm going to go back and 13,000 high-risk men only, age 35 to 57. This was a non-drug study. This was a dietary intervention study. So in this study, they randomized them into 2 groups. The first group was a control. The second group was, I'm sorry, I said it was a non-drug study. I sort of misspoke. There was only drugs used for hypertension. So in the treatment arm, the participants were instructed to stop smoking. They were given medication to control their blood pressure, and they were advised to consume a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet. So all that sort of makes sense, right? So go on a low-fat diet, stop smoking, control your blood pressure, and you guys over here just keep on doing what you're doing. And after 7 years, the intervention group had 41.2 deaths per 1,000 versus 40.4 deaths in the controls. There was no significant difference. And so this was viewed as the negative study that said, and you can see the title in the Wall Street Journal, Heart Attack, a Test Collapses. This was viewed as sort of a challenge to this hypothesis. Turned out the other study had a much greater impact. So this was the Lipid Research Clinic Coronary Primary Prevention Trial. I'll just refer to it as the LRC because I can't say that all the time. So the LRC, which was even a more expensive study, and this was also a pharmacologic intervention. So this study looked at 3,800 men who had elevated cholesterol, elevated blood cholesterol. But these men were asymptomatic. They weren't as high risk as the first group. This was double-blinded. The intervention here was twofold. Was diet, eat less fat, eat less cholesterol, and a new class of medication called a bile acid sequestrant. Has anybody heard of bile acid sequestrants? They sort of set the stage for what became some of the biggest blockbuster drugs in the world, which are statins. So prior to statins, which reduce cholesterol by limiting the critical enzyme step in cholesterol synthesis called HMG-CoA reductase, bile acid sequestrants were a much more crude way to lower cholesterol in the blood. Most cholesterol in our body is actually made by our body, but it gets circulated. So it gets made in our body. The lipoproteins carry it from the cells that make it to other cells. And most of it winds up going back to the liver. The liver packages cholesterol in lipoproteins and secretes it in bile. Bile ends up going through our GI tract, and in our gut, we reabsorb a fraction of that cholesterol. And so the cycle continues. So the bile acid sequestrant is the crudest way to get cholesterol out of the body. It sequesters and binds the bile acids in your GI tract and basically makes sure that more cholesterol is leaving your body through your stool than is getting repurposed and recirculated. So make no mistake about it, bile acid sequestrants, they worked. They will lower all of the cholesterol in your body, the good, the bad, the ugly. They're largely out of favor today because the side effects tend to be pretty miserable, and now that drugs are much more sophisticated, they're not used as often, but nevertheless they work. So this study took 3,800 asymptomatic men who did have elevated cholesterol, and it randomized them into two groups. The first group on the sort of low-fat, low-cholesterol diet and a bile acid sequestrant. The second group on a placebo control. I actually gave a talk at the University of Minnesota 2 years ago, and a man came up to me after and said, I was one of the subjects in that study. And so I've got a great picture with me and him standing there with like one of these guys. And so to this day, I don't think he ever found out if he got placebo or control. So nevertheless, at the end of this study, the 10-year mortality was 35.8 per 1,000 in the intervention group, the treatment group, versus 37.3 deaths per 1,000 in the control group, which, by the way, if you do the math on that, what's the absolute risk reduction? Virtually zero. Right? Virtually zero. But it was statistically significant. Not necessarily clinically significant, it was statistically significant. But of course, this was hailed as, sorry, it's true, cholesterol really is a killer. Now, remember how I said I collect magazines? This is one I bet many of you would remember in a moment. It's the one with the eggs and the bacon sad face. That's from this study. Okay, so the authors concluded appropriately in the paper as follows. Caution should be exercised before extrapolating the LRC findings to cholesterol-lowering drugs other than bile acid sequestrants. Very prudent thing to say, right? All this study told us is that a bile acid sequestrant with this dietary intervention did better than nothing. Doesn't mean that another drug that lowers cholesterol, okay, it's a very prudent thing to say. The LRC was not designed to assess directly whether cholesterol lowering by diet prevents coronary heart disease. I feel like Jimmy Kimmel. I mean, I completely agree with that, right? Okay. Now, Basil Rifkind, who was the NIH director of the LRC, took it one step further. It is now indisputable that lowering cholesterol with diet and drugs can actually cut the risk of developing heart disease and having a heart attack. Yeah, I think I still agree with that. I'm not sure about the diet part, but okay, it's true it was diet-drug combo. But of course the media, what do they care, right? I mean, it's like, what are you going to put a picture of a bile acid sequestrant on the cover of Time? Forget about it. You're going to show us some bacon and eggs, right? This has nothing to do with what the study was about, does it? Basil Rifkind goes one step further. The LRC results strongly indicate that the more you lower cholesterol and fat in your diet, the more you reduce your risk of heart disease. I feel like I'm back reading the Oglesby-Paul nonsense in the Washington Post. Where are you getting this? Right? Where are you getting this? Right? This is the limit of scientific evidence. This is the ethics of dietary guidelines. Tell me where you're getting that from. Because it sure as hell isn't from anything you've shown us. It sure as hell isn't from any of the data. It sure as hell isn't from a single experiment that's been done. Gary had the opportunity to interview Basil before his death in 2002, and he asked him that very question. His answer, it's an imperfect world. The data that would be definitive is ungettable, so you do your best with what's available. I don't know. I don't find that acceptable, personally. Yeah. In 1984, the NIH Consensus Conference, which was headed by Basil Rifkin, took place in Bethesda, Maryland. Again, one of the beauties of giving these talks is you always meet somebody interesting who adds a little bit to the history. I gave this talk as a grand round once at UCSD, and a woman came up to me after and said, I was one of the members of the consensus panel. I later validated this. I looked up who she was, and sure enough, she's a very prominent person, and she was, I think she's an endocrinologist. She was part of the panel, and she gave me the behind-the-scenes version of what actually happened at the NIH Consensus panel, which was they got brought into a room in Bethesda, they got sat down, and they got told, this is the consensus, sign it. And they fought and disagreed for a day and a half until they finally just agreed and signed it. But there was nothing about a consensus here. This was sort of, you're not getting out of this room until you sign it. So the conclusion from the NIH consensus statement was there is no doubt that a low-fat diet, no doubt, no doubt. There's like nothing, I can't say that about anything, except maybe like gravity. Like, I'm pretty sure if I jump off this stage, I will hit the ground. I'm so confident, in fact, I don't even need to do it. That is no doubt. Pretty much everything else in my life, there's doubt. But there is no doubt that a low-fat diet will afford significant protection against coronary heart disease to every American over the age of 2. Well, as the co-PI of the LRC study, Dan Steinberg, put it, if there had been a real consensus, you wouldn't have had to have had a consensus conference. A few years later, the National Academy of Science issued its tome, which stated that the highest priority is given to reducing fat intake because the scientific evidence concerning dietary fats and other lipids and human health is strongest, and the likely impact on public health is the greatest. And ladies and gentlemen, that's effectively how the story ended, right? Within a year, Nabisco had created a new product. And this goes back to what that staff person for McGovern was told in 1977. You guys think people are just going to eat a whole bunch more fruits and vegetables when you tell them not to eat fat? Keep thinking that, buddy. We're going to figure out something that is fat-free, cholesterol-free, and has no sodium in it. Don't even get me started on the sodium story. It's just as bad as this one. And we laugh about it now because Snackwells is so JV. I mean, who eats these things? They're probably disgusting. But at the day, this was a revolution. See, now you've got ciabatta yogurt instead, right? You've got all this other really good low-fat stuff. And if any of you have ever heard Rob Lustig talk, which I would never even try to speak to this like Rob does, I mean, low-fat is code for what? High sugar, right? The Webster's might as well just call them synonyms. Low-fat, high sugar. It's the same thing, okay? When I say low-fat, do you think broccoli? No. All right. So what's happened since the consensus? So the consensus was, by 1990, the game was over, right? I only talked about, I focused more on the proponents of this. There's a huge group of opponents. There's a huge group of people who fought the good fight and lost, if you believe, as I believe, that this was the wrong decision. So let's look at the evidence post-consensus. So let's start with the Cochrane collaboration, which has done 3 meta-analyses on this topic. Anyone not familiar, or I guess, is everybody familiar with the Cochrane collaboration? Okay. So the Cochrane collaboration in 2001 released its first meta-analysis on this topic, reduced or modified dietary fat for preventing cardiovascular disease. They looked at 27 well-controlled RCTs with 10,000 subjects in total, followed for an average of 3 years each. And they noted that the reduction of dietary fat had no effect on longevity and no significant effect on cardiovascular events. In 2006, they released a second meta-analysis titled Multiple Risk Factor Intervention for primary prevention of coronary heart disease. So this didn't look at only dietary fat. It looked at drugs. It looked at blood, smoking cessation, blood pressure reduction, things like that. It looked at 10 well-controlled trials with nearly 1 million patient years of intervention. And it said the pooled effects suggest multiple risk factor intervention has no effect on mortality. Again, that's kind of a shocking statement. This was reissued and updated 3 years ago, and now they looked at, they included 55 new trials, short-term trials of 6 and 12-month duration. And they said, again, contrary to expectations, multiple risk factor interventions had little or no impact on the risk of coronary heart disease, morbidity, or mortality. The largest prospective study ever conducted in nutrition, the Women's Health Initiative, which was published in 2006. This is a study that looked at nearly 50,000 postmenopausal women. They were randomized 60-40, so 60% of them, about 30,000, were in the treatment group. The treatment group was instructed to significantly reduce their consumption of saturated fat, to increase their consumption of fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. The control group was obviously a control, eat the standard American high-fat diet. After 6 years, the total fat consumption was reduced by 8.2%. Saturated fat was reduced by 2.9%. So the treatment group, let's see if I have my note on this. I think the treatment group did not get below 10% saturated fat. So about a 3%, it might have been something like 10.5%, 13.5%. There was also, of course, as some of you probably know, but not to be confused with this is not the hormonal treatment. So the Women's Health Initiative was primarily an HRT trial, but there was a separate nutrition trial, which is the one we're talking about. So interestingly, the average follow-up was 5.7 years. The intervention group, the low-fat, high fruits and vegetables, high grains group, did not reduce the risk of heart disease or stroke. The low-fat dietary pattern did not result in a statistically significant reduction in the risk of invasive breast cancer. There was no evidence that the low-fat dietary pattern reduced colorectal cancer, and there was no evidence that it reduced the risk of diabetes. So it failed on every metric to reduce what they were trying to reduce. Now again, whenever you see data like this, you can spin it any way you want, and the reality of it is I don't know the answer in the Women's Health Initiative. I really don't. Out of the gate, one of the biggest problems with the Women's Health Initiative is it was a free living study with relatively poor compliance. So don't know what to make of that. The authors argued that the reason the study was negative was it wasn't long enough. 5.7 years, they argued, was not long enough to see a reduction in heart disease. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But it seems to me that every time this hypothesis gets tested, it comes up sort of empty-handed. Christopher Gardner did a study in 2007 called the A2Z trial. Now, Christopher is an interesting guy, and I should just be completely transparent. Our organization, Nutrition Science Initiative, is currently funding a study that Christopher Gardner and John Ioannidis are conducting at Stanford University, which is actually a follow-up to this study. But nevertheless, this study in 2007 took about 320 premenopausal women and randomized them into 4 groups. And the hypothesis that Christopher wanted to test was, is it the carbs or the fat that's primarily responsible for weight loss and or metabolic dysregulation? And so he designed what I thought was a very elegant study at the time, especially on such a shoestring budget, which was creating 4 arms, each of which basically embraced a popular diet. And each one then had basically a gradation of fat content and carbohydrate content inversely. So on the one end of the spectrum, you had the Atkins diet, which of course everybody knows is a very low carbohydrate diet that obviously by extension increases the consumption of fat. And at the other end of the spectrum, you had the Ornish diet, which is very low in fat and conversely very high in carbohydrates. You had the Zone diet, which is sort of a moderate carb-restricted diet, and then the Learn diet, which is sort of like a USDA DASH type balanced diet, if you will. Now note, all of these diets are significant improvement if followed to the letter over the standard American diet, because even the Ornish diet, though it's very high in carbs, is very particular about what kind of carbs you can consume. There's no flour, there's no refined grain, there's no sugar. If we have time and anybody's interested, because some people are interested, just for the sake of time, I sort of don't talk about Dean Ornish's study because it's a relatively small study, but in 1991 he did publish a study in Lancet that looked at the reversal of heart disease on his diet. And if anybody's interested, maybe if we have Q&A, I can talk through that. But nevertheless, this was sort of the study. So you can see, just under 80 patients per arm. And at the end of the year, you can see that the people on the Atkins group had the greatest reduction in weight, the greatest reduction in triglyceride, and, I'm sorry, that's at 2 months. This is what I really wanted to show you. At 1 year, the greatest reduction in weight, the greatest reduction in triglyceride, the greatest increase in HDL, and for what it's worth, the greatest reduction in blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure. So this was a very counterintuitive finding. It was also counterintuitive because Christopher Gardner is a vegan. So, you can always look at these studies, and you always have to be a little skeptical of people with their own agendas, right? And that's why NUSI, for example, doesn't do research, right? I mean, Gary and I, who founded NUSI, have very strong bias. Well, you don't want to see research I'm doing, right? So you'd rather see independent and skeptical people doing the research. And similarly, I think Gardner's about as skeptical as they come, especially because his own personal dietary philosophy is one of a vegan diet. And so it was very surprising both to Gardner and I think to the nutrition community when he published a study that said actually the Atkins diet had the best result across the board. And he took a lot of flack for that. Another follow-up trial was the diet workplace trial by Shai. I think this was 300 subjects in this study. 322 study. This was a 2-year study which looked at the following. So you had a calorie-restricted, fat-reduced diet. You had a calorie-restricted Mediterranean diet, and you had an ad libitum low-carbohydrate diet. So the calorie-restricted means you give the subject a calorie target. We want you to eat 1,600 calories per day. The ad libitum says we want you to eat until you are satiated. Don't bother counting calories. Just eat as you feel comfortable. So you can see, like all dietary studies, you had a great improvement initially, and then everybody sort of probably slips a little bit. There's some recidivism. And by the end of that study, in body weight, this is body weight, there was no difference between the low-carb and the Mediterranean group, but both were statistically more significant in weight loss than the low-fat group. When you look at the biomarkers, now here, if it's colored in red, it tells you it's significant within the group from its baseline. If it's colored in blue, it tells you it's also significant with respect to the other group. So here you can see all of them reduced their blood pressure, so significantly from baseline, but no difference between each other, both systolically and diastolically. Nothing was significant in the LDL cholesterol reduction except for the Mediterranean group. Only the HDL cholesterol group, even though they all raised significantly, the carbohydrate restriction, i.e. those people eating the most fat, had the greatest increase in HDL cholesterol relative to the others. And the same is true for the reduction in triglycerides. And again, if you believe as I do that from a standard cholesterol panel, and I'm very interested in advanced testing, so all of this is really proxies for what's actually going on, which most people aren't measuring. But from the proxy standpoint, we saw repeatedly, I hope, today that these two things are probably far more predictive of your risk of heart disease than this one. Greatest reduction, the only one to have a significant reduction in in hemoglobin A1C, a measure of glycemic control, and C-reactive protein, a marker of inflammation. And very recently, in fact, many of you may have seen this was in the New York Times a month ago, another study in the Annals of Internal Medicine took just under 150 obese men and women, so these were all BMI above 30, without coronary heart disease, and they randomized them to a low carbohydrate diet versus a low fat diet. So the goal in the low carb arm was to stay under 40 grams per day. From personal experience, I will say that's really hard. The goal of the low fat diet was to keep total fat below 30% and saturated fat below 7%. This was a 1-year intervention, and they were not quite able to get that. At 1 year, the low carb group was at about 100 to 120 grams per day. So that's still really low, right? I mean, that's That means you're eating fruits and vegetables willy-nilly, but you're not having pizzas, you're not having bread, you're not having a lot of rice or pasta. The low-fat group was not able to get down to 7% saturated fat, but they were able to get down to 9%. So by contrast, the low-fat group was at 9% saturated fat. The low-carb group was about 13.5% saturated fat. So there was a difference between those two. Now, there was a significant reduction in weight. The primary outpoint of this was weight and then cardiovascular disease endpoints. And so the change in, so the dotted line is the low-carb group. So the low-carb group actually gained lean mass. I don't have a graph for overall weight, but their overall weight reduction was greater. There was actually no change in their LDL cholesterol. The low carbohydrate, high fat group had a greater increase in HDL cholesterol. And the person who wrote this up in the New York Times, I spoke with him before this, and he asked me a question. He said, do you think this study is interesting enough to write up? And I said, I think there's actually one thing about this study that's actually quite novel and interesting and is worth writing up. And I recommended who he should speak with as the experts on this topic. So remember how that Framingham cohort thing we talked about? Well, one of the things that came from the Framingham cohort was a Framingham risk calculator. So you could go online, any of you could go home today and go Framingham risk calculator and plug in your stats. How old you are, if you smoke or not, what your blood pressure is, how big your waist is, what your LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides are, all these things. And then it spits out your 10-year risk of heart disease. The first time I did this was when I was 36 years old. And that was sort of the wake-up call for me, which was, I'm supposedly this fit guy swimming marathons following the food pyramid to the letter, but I have a 9% chance of a heart attack before I'm 50. That was a wake-up call. And I've since learned a great deal about cardiovascular disease, much, much more than we can go into today, and it's really become my obsession in life. The greatest risk factor for heart disease is what, if you had to guess? Yeah, I would say that. So, and even though we can't really measure that clearly, we know it. So that, you're probably correct. Of things we can measure, what's the greatest risk? No? Hard to measure. Smoking's huge, but there's something even greater. It's so obvious you won't get it. It's actually age. But why? But why is that the case? No, I said measure. Yeah. If you figure out how to control age, though, let's have that discussion. Yeah. So why is that? Well, once you really get into the nuts and bolts of what cardiovascular disease results from, and I'll just sort of be technical about it for 30 seconds. Cardiovascular disease, to be very precise, results from ApoB-bearing lipoproteins abutting the endothelium of your cardiovascular vessels, penetrating into the subendothelial space, depositing their cholesterol and sterile cargo, creating an inflammatory response that leads to the oxidization of those things, greater endothelial leak, and plaque formation that ultimately results in unstable plaques being, abutting off this thing and causing coronary occlusion. That's actually how coronary artery disease has nothing to do with arteries getting clogged up by fat or any of that crap. That's total nonsense. Okay. Nothing impacts that more than the passage of time. The older you are, the more you've been on this earth, the more chance you have for one of those processes, largely stochastic, to take place. The reason we want fewer LDL particles, not LDL cholesterol as we've talked about today. The reason we want fewer LDL particles is the more particles you have, the more chance they hit the endothelium. The longer you've been alive, the more chance it's hit the endothelium. So age trumps. And what you'll notice if you play with the Framingham risk calculator is tweak the age and you'll tweak the results. As time goes on, it becomes very hard to reduce your risk of heart disease. So an ideal goal is to keep it flat. So the thing that I suggested to the New York Times reporter that was interesting in this study was the Framingham risk calculator over 1 year actually showed a decrease in the subjects on the high-fat, low-carb diet. And to me, that's actually very interesting because it's really hard to reverse time from a coronary artery disease standpoint. And you could argue the low-fat group did pretty well. Notice how theirs didn't go up that much. You normally see a slightly bigger increase year to year. So I've just told you the story, and we're wrapping up here, but I just want to sort of bring it back to where we go. So I told you the story, and you're going to go home, and you're going to think about it, and you're going to think of 10 things that you're going to be like, that just seems ridiculous. Like, that guy pulled a fast one on us. There's got to be something in this story we didn't hear, because the way he presented it, it's sort of suspect at best, right? The way I like to think about it is, why was there so much cultural confidence in this dietary heart fat hypothesis? And I think it can be broken down into 2 time points, okay? I think prior to 1984, it really came from our unscientific brains' belief in a story, largely driven by epidemiology. So let's just be really clear. Everyone in this room, we all think we're smart, we get science, we know all this stuff. I want to be real clear. We are not hardwired to think scientifically. In fact, I wrote a blog post about it that's got to be my favorite blog post I've ever written, which is, I basically explain, and I can't take credit for it, it was all a buddy of mine's discussion over dinner one day that prompted me to do this, but I basically explained that it's actually evolutionarily to our disadvantage to think scientifically. It turns out only in the last couple hundred years would it be of benefit to do so, but if you go back for millions of years, it's actually not to our evolutionary advantage to think scientifically. And so to this day, even though many of us are educated and we like to think scientifically, it's very easy to revert into our primitive brains, which don't really like science. And prior to 1984, the story was so compelling. Populations that eat lots of fat get heart disease. I mean, how can you argue with that? Who cares about all the confounders, Peter, and maybe they also ate a lot of sugar because rich people had access to sugar and poor people didn't, and well, who cares about that? If you ate fat, you got heart disease. Like, it didn't matter if you were the head of the NIH, the head of Harvard, or some schmo on the street, or a Time magazine reporter. That story makes sense. And that really accounted for the confidence. I think post-1984, it became something a little more complicated, which is we now know that drugs that lower cholesterol do lower your risk of heart disease. Now, that in and of itself is a topic that we could spend 4 hours discussing. It's much more nuanced than we want to believe. The effect is not as great as we think it is. It's probably not great in all populations. There's probably some populations in whom that's complete and utter nonsense. But more or less, we've accepted the fact that when we give people drugs that lower cholesterol, we lower their risk of heart disease. And we know that when you eat more fat, on average, your total cholesterol, and sometimes even your LDL cholesterol, goes up. The problem is nobody understands, or 1/100th of 1% of the population truly understands the relationship between the lipoproteins and the cholesterol. So the caveat is drugs and diet are not compatible. Drugs have lots of actions, as do diets. A great quote from the statistician at the University of Washington, saying that statins reduce heart disease by lowering cholesterol is like saying aspirin reduces heart disease by reducing headaches. Sounds silly when you phrase it that way. Well, questions? Do you want me to pick, or does someone? Do you want to be the picker? All right.
This question over here.
Synopsis of pathophysiology of heart disease that you gave. One of the things that you mentioned in there was the inflammatory component. It sounds like C-reactive protein would be like your best marker for that. Is that not true, or is that too simple?
I'll repeat the question only because my guess is maybe not everybody heard it. So his question was, during the discussion of the pathophysiology of heart disease, I commented that one of the critical steps in that pathway is the inflammatory response, which is correct. And then he asked, does that mean that something like C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker we measure, is that a more important biomarker of risk? Okay, so what do we know about CRP? So we know that elevated CRP is an independent predictor of cardiovascular risk. So that's true. In my practice medically and the way I think about this, and it was really, I have to credit Ron Krauss for helping me think through this. And Ron Krauss, like I said, is sort of one of the 3 people in North America that I would sort of put on a pedestal of being cardiovascular gods. So Alan Snyderman, Tom Dayspring, Ron Krauss. These people are, I've learned so much from them, it's unbelievable. And Ron was the guy who really helped me think through this framework, which is, Never confuse treatable with non-treatable markers of risk, and never confuse specific with diffuse markers of risk. So CRP is in the double camp, the double whammy camp, which is it's both non-specific and non-treatable. So it's true that an elevated level of CRP is highly associated with increased risk of heart disease. But one, it's actually not specific. So, I've done, oh, by the way, at lunch or before lunch, or sort of in the little intermission when I tell you my funny story, my dental story, throughout the process of the episode I'll describe to you guys, I was checking my blood every 2 weeks. You can't believe how high my CRP got. So as an endodontist, I promise you, when somebody's showing up in your office with an abscess or something, their CRP is through the roof. It's an inflammatory response. So it's hard to know, and I've also shown, at least in myself, that even my travel schedule can tweak my CRP. So now you could argue that maybe that's increasing your risk of heart disease as well, but it's a little harder to make that connection. Furthermore, it's actually hard to directly lower CRP. We actually have better markers of inflammation than CRP that are cardiovascular specific. So we have LPPLA2, which is probably the best one today. That's both a marker for endothelial inflammation and also oxidation of LDL particles. Also myeloperoxidase, which another example of one that you guys, if you guys were checking myeloperoxidase, I think you'd see it going through the roof on patients with dental issues because the huge macrophage response. Again, not as specific to heart disease, but I think when taken in concert, these do this. So when I'm evaluating somebody for heart disease, I'm not just interested in their lipoproteins, I am interested in all of those inflammatory markers. I don't know if that answers your question, but so it's complicated, but you're right. Inflammation, super important.
Yes.
Peter, I think to a certain extent this morning you're kind of preaching to the choir in that your story of how this nutrition research has sort of gone so wrong with you. I think people who've been following the track that Dr. Carr's been on for the last couple of years probably didn't know the details of the story, but I don't think it would really surprise them. But the question that I have is, it seems to me, if you think about your lecture and the other one, all you're really left with is skepticism. I mean, here you have very powerful, very authoritative government agencies that have been insisting on things are this way for decades, and yet you really find out after this that what they're telling you really isn't true, that there really isn't any science behind it. So what do you really do other than just basically disbelieve everything you hear, figuring they're just likely to be wrong as anybody else is? I mean, it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in all of these supposedly authoritative individuals and organizations.
Well, I agree with you. It doesn't, but I would leave this with a glimmer of hope, right? So I would say that, and I don't know that I could say this as a blanket statement to everyone in this country, but certainly to a group like yourselves, the moral of the story should be become scientifically literate enough to understand these things for yourself. I mean, there's nothing I showed you here that you need a PhD in nutritional biochemistry to figure out. I mean, all you got to do is go back and, you just read the papers, right? I was in the locker room at my gym about a year ago, and I bumped into my doctor there, who's a really, really wonderful guy. And a study had just come out in the New England Journal of Medicine. I don't even remember what the topic was, but it was so clearly BS. And the New York Times, Gina Colada had picked it up and written her usual crap. And he said to me, he goes, "Hey, Peter, did you see the study in the New England Journal of Medicine last week?" And I said, yeah, I saw it. And I said, did you read the study? He goes, "No, I just don't have the time. I mean, I read the piece in the Times, and like I'm not going to bust his balls, but I said, look, I mean, that's sort of the problem here, right? You're a frontline provider, okay? I don't necessarily expect the single mother of 5 to be scouring the New England Journal of Medicine, but I think as a medical community, we have a pretty significant responsibility to be doing that. And so you got to go back and you got to read the paper. And you got to assume, for every time a guy at the New York Times like Anahad O'Connor gets it right, there's 2 coconuts that get it wrong. I mean, it's just the way it is. So look, everything I said here, I just pulled out of the paper. This was a very, my voiceover was the editorial, but the text alone here is just pulled out of the papers directly. And so I think that's the first thing, is you just got to get comfortable saying, look, you're right. You can't have the USDA be the one telling you what to eat. There's a blatant conflict of interest. The USDA, the entity that promotes dietary guidelines, has a stated purpose to promote agriculture. I don't even see how you can do those two things together. I mean, we wouldn't allow that in any other field. That's sort of like saying, you know, we're going to have the medical profession give medical care and at the same time be its own legal oversight for malpractice. You have to separate those two. And so I think what you've got to be able to do is, so the uncomfortable reality of it for you all is, get the papers, read them, and I mean, it sounds goofy, but in an ideal world, boy, you know, we'd have like-minded people that would sort of sit around in email chat rooms and have a journal club, right? I mean, I feel fortunate, you know, you mentioned I trained with Steve Rosenberg. I mean, so my training is in immunology. So, but I feel fortunate that the guy who trained me was such a good scientist that he basically, you know, I remember one of the most powerful things he told me, which was, and Ioannidis has taken this to a whole new level in his analysis of this, but, you know, I remember Steve Rosenberg saying 79% of papers that are published in PubMed are never cited again. That basically tells you 79% of papers are complete garbage. I mean, they can't even be cited once again. So I asked Ioannidis once, I said, what percentage of stuff that you think is published is legit? And he said about 3%. It's horrible. So it's not just reading the paper, it's reading the paper and scrutinizing it, looking for the limitations and saying, you know, I mean, look, every one of these things, these free living studies, the first limitation always has to be is how do we know what they actually ate? Are we really relying on food frequency questionnaires to figure out? And so that's sort of my high level, you know, suggestion. I think the other point, which is just a personal one for me, is that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. I mean, that's why I quit my job and started a nonprofit with Gary, because basically I just got so goddamn sick and tired of this nonsense that I was like, well, if the NIH isn't going to get off their ass and fund this stuff, we'll figure out a way to do it ourselves. We'll get people to, you know, give us the money, and we'll do what we'll do in a decade what the NIH was supposed to do 50 years ago, and we'll probably do it for 2% of the cost. But we do have to know the answer to these questions. This is unacceptable. I mean, for all the things people get fired up about, you know, one guy with Ebola in, you know, Dallas, I mean, like, more chatter about that than the fact that 4,000 people are going to die today of heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and cancer. 4,000 died yesterday. 4,000 are going to die tomorrow. That really ought to be what we care about.
What I was wondering is basically, you know, what kind of diet do you eat? I'm curious if you eat bacon. Do you take vitamins? What did you find out with drinking alcohol? Like, how does that, you did test your blood work quite a bit, so I'm just curious, you know, what the findings were around that.
I know I sound like I'm punting on this, but it's just so uninteresting. Who cares what I eat, right? Like, I mean, do you want to exercise like I exercise? Do you want to eat like I eat? Do you want to sleep like I sleep? Do you want to work like I work? You don't, right? It's not relevant. What's relevant is what should you eat, right? You guys ought to be not asking what do I eat, because it doesn't matter. There's so much individual variation amongst humans that the nuances of how much bacon I eat or how many eggs I eat or, you know, what I do, I mean, it's not that I'm not happy to share that information. I just think it's a complete distraction from the issue that's at hand here. The issue that's at hand is, as a result of this complete debacle, 4,000 people are dying every day, and our healthcare system is burdened with somewhere between $1 and $2 billion a day in unnecessary spending. That's the thing that should have everyone irate. Now, on a personal level, I will tell you this, that there are a handful of principles I've observed to be largely reasonable, right? So I have not noticed many people who do better when they have more sugar in their diet than less. I think there are some people who seem largely immune from the deleterious effects of sugar and highly processed and refined carbohydrates. My wife is one of them. She can pretty much eat whatever the heck she wants, and it doesn't seem to matter. But, 37. No, but her 96-year-old grandmother was the same way. I mean, you know, weighed 100 pounds and ate pasta all day, every day. So there are people, and I've actually had our analysts do a pretty detailed analysis of this, and we would estimate that about 20% of the US population seems largely immune to the dietary triggers of disease. Okay. But 80% do not. 80% appear to actually benefit significantly from reducing their glycemic load, from minimizing insulin levels. And yeah, the way to do that is to eat fewer carbohydrates, especially what I like to call the sort of crappy, cheap carbohydrates. Not cheap economically, but cheap nutritionally, right? So yeah, I don't eat sugar, I don't eat grains, I don't eat those things. But again, that's more because I've been able to meticulously chronicle in myself the impact that those things have had on me. And in my case, it's very clear that those things have had a negative effect on my health.
When you were in your worst state, you were saying that you were swimming, you were eating a lot of carbs. What kind of diet were you consuming at that time?
I was consuming what I think you would describe as an athlete's diet. So very high in complex carbohydrates, lots of sports drinks, because if you swim 4 hours a day, you typically, that would be probably consuming, 3 liters worth of liquid glucose and fructose. Always loved fruits and vegetables, lots of shakes, that kind of stuff. It wasn't like I wasn't eating a trashy diet, right? I mean, I didn't eat fast food. So you would at the surface look at my diet and say it was probably better than the average American. But I do think that there's a tipping point where I think my system just couldn't cope with the quantity of glucose and fructose in my diet.
And you were having metabolic disease at that time when you did test?
Yeah, I had metabolic syndrome. So, meaning I met 3 of those 5 criteria that we talked about. And, my insulin, you can do a test where you drink glucose and they measure glucose and insulin. I was pre-diabetic. And look, I mean, to be honest with you, it started out more from vanity. I was just tired of being fat. I mean, that sort of pissed me off, to be completely honest with you. Like, if you're swimming 4 hours a day, you kind of expect to be ripped. Like, you just sort of expect that, right? And it was like, I think this is kind of ridiculous that I'm not ripped, but I'm like fat. And so that just upset me. But I think then I realized, actually, there's more here than that. That was sort of the tip of the iceberg. The reality of it was, I come from a family where heart disease is a very big problem. And, my father, who's still alive, has sort of somehow managed to outlive all his brothers. But, I mean, every brother in his side died in their 40s of heart disease. So, I think it was just, I want to do something about this. And luckily, I think my vanity at least brought me brought this to my consciousness earlier, maybe while there was still time to do something about it.
We had a physician speak to our local dental group. His thing was small LDL particle versus large. Do you have any take on that?
I do. That's a very interesting question. So the question is, we've all now got to the point where we're accepting that LDL cholesterol is not the really interesting thing, but the interesting thing is probably the LDL particle itself. So not the cholesterol that's in it. Think of that as the cargo. The LDL particle is the boat. So it's the boat that's causing damage, not the cargo on the boat, right? The cargo only matters when it gets deposited. So the question was, well, there's size differences. Not even all LDL particles are the same. There's small ones and there's big ones. There is absolutely no doubt that the association between cardiovascular disease, this is almost as true as the gravity thing when I jump up. There's almost no doubt that the association between cardiovascular disease and small LDL particles is very high. Meaning, if you took 2 people, both who had the same number of LDL particles, but one of those people had very small particles and one of them had very large particles, the one with small particles is at much greater risk. The question is, particle for particle, is that actually true? In other words, is the small particle simply a marker for something else that's going on? Another metabolic, because we know that people who are insulin resistant have small particles. People who are very insulin sensitive tend to have large particles. We do know, for example, that eating a diet high in fat and low in carbohydrates raises LDL, but it raises the large particle, not the small particle. The answer to this question is not yet known, and I have spoken with the people who lead the charge on both sides of the argument. So there is the particle as a particle camp that says, particle for particle, they are all equally destructive, meaning a 20 nanometer and a 23 nanometer particle are identical. Both of those particles have the same probability of infiltrating the subendothelial wall, of being retained, of depositing sterol, of getting oxidized. There's another camp that says, no, that's actually not true. The small particle on its own is actually more likely to undergo those things. So that's something we don't yet know the answer to. It's a question I'm very interested in. And getting back to the question about CRP, when I talked about treatable versus untreatable things, this is very important, I think, for the field of cardiovascular medicine because it has a therapeutic implication. You see, you could argue that small particle targeting should actually be a priority if you believe that the small particle is uniquely more harmful than the large one. So it's absolutely worthwhile to get the test that counts the number of particles. And by definition, virtually every one of those tests will do a size quantification of those as well. So the answer is yes, but I think it's at the very least to know the number of particles you have because that's the single greatest treatable risk factor for cardiovascular disease, is to reduce the number of LDL or ApoB bearing particles. The reason I say ApoB bearing is there are other particles in the body that are even more harmful than LDL particles that most people don't think about, but they all carry an ApoB lipoprotein.
A whole bunch of your talks centered on the problems with the evidential base. We have that same problem in dentistry. Of course, it shouldn't surprise anybody coming from me. What is medicine doing about that? If Ionitis thinks 97% of the stuff is junk, what steps are you guys taking in the peer review process and the editorial process?
You know, this is a really important question. I actually went up to Stanford about 9 months ago to spend a day with John just to discuss this. So came away from that discussion sort of thinking that the following issues exist. So you guys have probably figured this out yourself. Anytime something's really effed up, there's probably a bunch of causes that reinforce each other, right? I mean, it's hard to get really messed up without a whole bunch of things conspiring. So what is the sum of forces that have us in the state we're in today? I would say it's the following. And I say this really is, John deserves at least as much credit because this was sort of a joint brainstorming session. So the first is the system of funding. The system of funding research is broken. The largest funder, obviously in the United States, is NIH, and it's broken for a couple reasons. It's broken both for the size of grant that they award is shrinking by the day. So you're moving towards, well, I won't get into that in great detail. I would just say the following. The funding system is broken for a whole bunch of reasons we could spend a day talking about, but I'll tell you what the net result is. The net result is the process of acquiring grants has in and of itself turned into the objective. So the objective is no longer, I want to get a grant because it's simply a means by which I'm going to do exceptional science. It's, I'm going to get a grant because that is my whole goddamn objective. If I don't get a grant, I don't have a job. If I don't have a job, I don't get tenure. If I don't get tenure, blah, blah, blah. So we've lost the reason for why we do science. Science has now become a way to just keep yourself in the game. Okay. So that's the funding problem. And then that's reinforced at the university level through the system of promotion, which is we promote to tenure based on publication. So your incentive as an investigator is, and I've spoken with so many investigators about this, would you rather have one really exceptional paper, and again, let's ignore the journal for a moment, one exceptional paper that really made a difference in the field, or 10 sort of marginal incremental noise BS papers to line the CV? And the answer is, look, if I'm going to get promoted, I have to do X, Y, and Z. The third problem lies in actually the journals themselves. So you got to remember that so we're used to talking about like the big journals, right? Everybody's heard of the New England Journal of Medicine, the Annals of Medicine, Lancet, JAMA, Science, Nature. Okay, how many are there? I asked John this question. How many English language biomedical journals are there on PubMed? I wish I had my notebook with me because I took meticulous notes from this discussion. The answer was staggering. It was something like 40 or 50,000. It could have been 15,000, I don't know. But the number was so ridiculous that clearly you can't identify 99% of them. So my question was, 99% of the journals out there are unreadable. Like, they're literally just gibberish. Why do they exist? And the answer is, they are businesses. They get paid to put papers in them. Paid by the authors. Yeah. I'm an author. I just did a paper on whatever goofy topic it is. I submit it to Crapo Journal number 2. They accept it, and I pay them $500 for reprint rights. It's a business. These journals exist to make money. So, unfortunately, most people just assume that if something's published, it's sort of like, oh, well, it's published. Like it's got to be right. But obviously that's not true. And so the trifecta is this broken editorial system in the journals, this broken system of promotion in the university, and this broken system of funding has created a vicious cycle. Now, my thought is that our organization is tackling one of those problems, which is the funding problem. So our organization, look, the median NIH grant is $288,000. Now, for $288,000, you can sort of do nothing. So our view is don't just take the incremental approach, which says, like, manage risk by spreading it out across everybody. Like, if you guys were all the scientists in the world, the NIH's approach would be, we're going to, sort of think we identify the best 20% of you, and we'll spread the wealth out equally amongst you. The NUSI approach is, we're going to pick 2 of you and give you all the money, right? Now, you might say, Peter, that's crazy. It's actually not crazy. You have to think about risk management. If you're trying to be mediocre and average, you should absolutely diversify. Have you ever talked to a really successful hedge fund person? They don't diversify anything, right? The most successful, the most wealthy hedge fund people in the world do zero diversification. They have enormous and few positions. You pick the winners and you go big. I mean, Warren Buffett became the 3rd richest guy in the world by value investing, which is, there's no diversity involved in this. And so I don't think there should be diversity in funding, right? I think it should be about, if there are really only 3% of people who can do exceptional work, they should be given far more resources to do far more work. The publication problem is one I've turned to John. And I've said, John, I really think your work and the organization that you can build is really the type of thing that has to put pressure on those journals. So the editorial staff of the top 10 journals really need to take a stand and say, we're the leaders in this field. We're going to change the way this process is done. If you can exact a change at the highest level, I think a trickle-down effect occurs. I believe the university system, I don't know how to fix. I mean, that's beyond my pay grade. So I don't know how to fix it, but you could argue that it will fix itself if the other 2 get fixed. But maybe not, I don't know.
Is there some advantage to the NIH as an organization to fund a lot of small grants rather than a few big grants, or is there something else at play in why they're doing what they're doing?
Well, I mean, I think, look, so first, there is absolutely an advantage to the NIH existing. I mean, I don't want to sort of completely throw the NIH under the bus. I think the NIH does lots of great work in lots of great areas, but there are biases within every organization, including the NIH.
You said the size of their grants.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, the size of their grants are shrinking because the pot of money is shrinking, right? It does not, and that has to do with that's a philosophical and cultural feature of the NIH.
I have a question. Some of the studies that you quoted, the Minnesota study, etc., the recall was like 4.5 years between mortality, and then there were other studies as well. We are here, in endodontics, we are looking at number of years of recall, and we are saying, hey, anything less than 5, 10 is really not much of a recall. And here we have significant studies that impact the whole population in terms of livelihood and death. And here we are relying on a 4.5-year recall. Is that sufficient? I mean, are there any studies that you know that look at much more longer term, say 10 to 15 to 20 years of being on one diet that would increase or decrease the mortality?
Yeah, not prospectively, no. And that's the challenge, right? So epidemiology and ecology give you that retrospectively. But I hope I've been able to at least convince you somewhat that that's a very dangerous game to play. Epidemiology can tell you anything, right? Even the most elegant, beautiful stories. So Ansel Keys of yesteryear was sort of the China study of today, right? But at the end of the day, it just tells me that calorically restricted, malnourished people living in Asia who ate no meat, no sugar, no refined foods get fewer diseases. Okay, that's an easy thing to believe. Are you going to try to tell me why? It's impossible. So to do that, you have to do an experiment. And the experiment, by definition, has to be randomized and it has to be prospective. And as you pointed out, typically the longest of these is maybe 7 years. Now, there is actually an experiment that's worth mentioning that I should put in here called PREDIMED. Has anybody heard of PREDIMED? It was published about 1.5 years ago. In fact, I really do need to include it in here. I don't include it in here because the primary outpoint was actually, it was more of a diabetes study, but it got stopped early because of the cardiovascular observation. So PREDIMED was a study done in Spain. It took 7,500 subjects and randomized them into 3 groups, 2,500 per arm. The first group was put on a very low-fat diet. The second and third groups were both put on Mediterranean diets, but with a different bend. So the first Mediterranean group was primarily focused on more consumption of olive oil. The other Mediterranean group was primarily focused on consumption of more nuts. And I actually think the study has a ton of limitations. The largest of them, something called performance bias. Performance bias is when the investigators interact more with one subject group than another. And it's that interaction alone that can actually have an impact on the behavior of the subjects. And so an exceptional study, of which there are none, eliminates performance bias by giving the same amount of face time, instruction, and interaction across both treatment and control groups, which this did not do. So I want to state that that is the major limitation of PREDIMED. If you had told me at the outset that this study, which was only a dietary intervention, in primary prevention was going to have an outcome, a finding, I would have said not a chance in hell. Because primary prevention is really hard. Even statins haven't really ever been shown to have efficacy in primary prevention. They've shown strong efficacy in men for secondary prevention, weak in primary prevention, nothing in women. So primary prevention says, can I make an impact before you've had a heart disease event? Secondary says, you've already had one, can I prevent a recurrence? You can see why secondary prevention studies are easier to do because you've got a higher concentration of risk in your patient population. So back to PREDIMED, you've got a you've got a high-risk primary population. So what they did that was really smart was they picked people that basically had metabolic syndrome who hadn't yet had a heart attack. So you picked people who were close to the edge of the cliff who'd never gone over. You did this deal on them. The study got halted after 4.5 years because, and we halt studies all the time when the finding is so strong because it becomes unethical to continue. The finding was both the Mediterranean groups had significantly fewer cardiac deaths than the low-fat group. This was a dietary study. Primary prevention. So that really answers that question. Now, again, as I said, the real limitation of that study was, do we know if that was entirely due to the diet, or is it possible that some of that was due to the intervention? In other words, did all the people in the Mediterranean group, because they were getting more intervention, they were getting olive oil and nuts mailed to them every week? I mean, they had all of these environmental cues telling them that they were part of this study. Who knows? Maybe they were doing more yoga, more meditating, whatever other things we think might be involved in heart disease. So we don't really know. But that's the model of the type of study that I think is necessary to resolve this question one way or the other. So in other words, can you do PREDIMED-like studies without the performance bias? And I believe the answer is emphatically yes. And I believe that emphatically that's the only way to unscrew this problem, to find out once and for all. But for what it's worth today, most cardiologists on the street are recommending to their patients a Mediterranean diet rather than a low-fat diet, and that is almost single-handedly a result of PREDIMED. Which, by the way, I do think is a step in the right direction. All right, well, thank you very much for your, oh, sorry, one more question.
What about the use of the statins in heart patients who already have a low cholesterol?
Well, you know, I think unfortunately most physicians prescribing statins aren't really aware of why we should use them. So I know it's sort of in vogue these days to bash statins, and I certainly don't do that, right? I mean, I bash the overuse of statins. The metaphor I would use is a statin is like a Phillips screwdriver. It's an excellent tool if you have a Phillips head screw that needs to be screwed into something. It's a crappy tool if you have a nail that needs to go into a piece of wood or a piece of glass that needs to be scored. And yet, most people, most sort of on-the-street docs use statins as sort of a knee-jerk reaction to someone who is at risk or someone who has elevated cholesterol or someone who has a... And so the reality of it is a statin is very specific. It is a inhibitor of cholesterol synthesis, de novo cholesterol synthesis. And so to use a statin, in my mind, you have to, at the very least, establish two things. One, the patient has an elevated level of ApoB, or an elevated level of LDL particles. Don't care about the cholesterol. Don't care about how much cargo's on the boat. I only care how many boats there are. And two, I have to at least establish through a very elaborate assay that most doctors don't do, that they actually oversynthesize cholesterol. Half the people walking around out there with elevated cholesterol aren't oversynthesizing cholesterol. They're overabsorbing their own cholesterol. That's a very different treatment plan. Now, my thought on this is much more nuanced than I could get into today because it also has to do with other risk factors. For example, is this a person that carries a gene that would predispose them to, say, Alzheimer's disease? Have they had head trauma in their life? And if so, I'm going to be much more likely to want to minimize cholesterol inhibition because of its importance in the brain, and so we'll look for other strategies around it. There's so many factors going on. So the short answer is I don't know I can't, just by knowing someone's cholesterol number in the standard sense, I couldn't even make a judgment about it. But unfortunately, outside of the community of sort of lipidologists, who unfortunately are not writing the majority of prescriptions on these medications, I believe statins are very overly prescribed.
You know, don't you think that in the studies that we do here in the United States, we are really changing what we call food. When we are telling patients to have low fat, what really does it mean? Because we are not paying attention to the sequence of eating, and the quality of eating, and the timing of eating, and the joy of the eating. And I have the impression that, you know, here in the United States, we are changing the definition of food. So let's say that you fund a study. How that study is going to become stronger if even you respect all those criteria. If you're just going to tell people eat low carb or low fat, what really what's the definition of that?
You're right. Just to give a high-level macronutrient prescription is insufficient, unless you're doing what's called an effectiveness study. So remember, in science, you always have to distinguish between efficacy and effectiveness. So, for example, Christopher Gardner's A to Z study was a classic example of an effectiveness study. Effectiveness studies test the effectiveness of a prescription. So in that study, Christopher Gardner said, I want you this part of the room is going to go on an Atkins diet. Here's the book. Here are the instructions. Go forth and conquer. Even though he may have strong views about exactly how that should be formulated, he's testing the effectiveness of that prescription. That's very different from an efficacy study. An efficacy study is trying to understand at a more mechanistic level exactly what the intervention is. So a study that might be interested in looking at the mechanistic level or the true effectiveness of something would have to be much more clear. In fact, you probably couldn't do that in a free living setting. You'd have to domicile patients. You'd have to bring patients into a hospital, and you'd have a control group and a treatment group, and you would make every component of their diet identical, all the things you talked about, but you would make one significant change. That would be the variable you're measuring. Now, that would have no immediate direct real-world bearing, but it would answer the question. So for example, if you are trying to figure out if smoking is the environmental trigger of lung cancer, the efficacy study is the removal of cigarettes, is taking two groups of people, one who smokes, one who does not, and they do everything else the same. Once you establish that cigarettes do in fact cause lung cancer and emphysema, then you would do an effectiveness study, which is I'm going to take two groups of smoker and I'm going to give these guys a book that, or maybe 5 groups. These guys get a book on how to quit smoking. These guys get nicotine patches. These guys get Nicorette gum. These guys get electroshock therapy. And there, what you're looking at is the effectiveness of your intervention. Those are two different questions. They're both very important, but we are far too often interested in effectiveness studies and not interested enough in efficacy studies. And that is almost a surefire recipe to waste as much money and time as possible. The story really starts like a couple years ago when, probably like every naive idiot, I went into a dentist's office without doing any due diligence on whether the guy was good or just a hack. And I don't know, I just wasn't paying attention. And he was sort of like, look, you've had these fillings since you were a kid. We should definitely replace them all. And so it begins. So I'm like, yeah, that sounds good. And so he replaces them all. And then like, a day later, I'm like, God, this is really interesting. Like, this really hurts. Like, even just breathing hurts. So I went back in, and again, not doing my homework. He's like, oh, looks like you're going to need a root canal. Let me do that for you. So he did that. And that didn't go very well. And then at this point, I started doing my homework and realized, oh, there's actually a type of dentist that specializes in doing this. And I remember, I'm a surgeon. Like, you wouldn't let like a general surgeon do cardiac surgery on you. You wouldn't let a cardiac surgeon do brain surgery on you. Yet somehow I just thought, like, this guy should do. So anyway, then I went and saw an endodontist and learned that I, of course, had multiple roots. I guess you typically have 2 anterior, 1 posterior. Is that right? Yeah. So I'm a double dude, and I have really long roots. I'm highly complicated. So this guy ends up, the endodontist. This was up in San Francisco. He did me right, so that he fixed that problem, and put a crown in. And to make a long story short, now I'm living in San Diego, and I'm sort of on the road to recovery. And then I get another pain in a different tooth. This time I go straight to an endodontist. Oh, no, actually, I'm not making this up. Literally, I fell for the same trick twice. A new dentist decided to do a swap on a filling, and again, I needed a root canal. This time I did go straight to the endodontist, and this is really interesting because I don't see him here today, by the way. I won't name him by name. I thought he was actually very good, by the way, but I want to know if this part is true. He gets in there and he says, the abscess is so bad that the lidocaine will have no effect. Now, I actually know that is true from draining peripheral abscesses in the ER. Because of the pH, the lidocaine is ineffective. So he goes, there's good news and there's bad news. The bad news is I can't take the pain away from this while I kill the nerve. You're going to feel it. The good news is you won't feel it for long. So he's like, so I said to him before he did anything, I said, have you ever had a root canal? He goes, never. I said, so you have no idea what I'm feeling at this minute. Is that correct? That's correct. So I like grab on this chair while he drills through the tooth, takes saline and just goes, tsh. And I can honestly say that's the most amazing pain I've ever felt in my life, to that point. So we do all that. Now fast forward till January of this year. Now, my current job is basically, I'm a nonstop fundraiser. That's basically all I do. I intermittently do other stuff, but I pretty much just live to travel around and raise money for a nutrition science initiative. So I was on a trip in San Francisco, and on the way back on that flight, I noticed my tooth was really hurting. This is a tooth that had a previous crown in it. And I got back that night, and I went to sleep, and I woke up in a lot of pain the next morning, and I was like, I must really be stressed out, because I must be like grinding this thing down to a pulp. And over the course of the day, the pain became so bad, I noticed I needed to start taking some Tylenol, which is pretty unusual for me. And then the gram of Tylenol every 4 hours turned into a gram of Tylenol plus 800 of Motrin every 8 hours. And by Sunday morning, I was like beside myself. And then Monday, I had a full day, so I couldn't do anything about it. So I'm at work having like back-to-back stuff going on. And I had a dinner meeting that night, and I couldn't even interact with the people I was eating with. The thing that was interesting to me was I didn't have any temperature sensitivity. Like I could still drink hot and cold, but I had a pain that was even more significant than the pain that led to the root canal. So much so that I looked like an idiot interacting with people because all I could do was this. Like I was just doing this the whole time. And by this point now I've just got onto hard drugs. So now I'm taking oxycodone, because I've got like a supply of all this crap from previous dental issues, right? So Tuesday morning I go in and I see my general dentist, who's a very nice fellow, and I say, something's going on here. And I said, but I got to be honest with you, I don't have a lot of patience for screwing around. Frankly, if you could just take the tooth out, that would be great. It's a tooth that's already had a root canal, it's been crowned twice, and I live on the road, so why don't we just take the tooth out? So he does an x-ray, we see a radiolucency. He goes, oh, I think you've got an abscess. We'll just drill it out, it'll be good. And I said, all right. So he, cuts through the crown, drills the thing out. He goes, okay, all taken care of. And I said, this might sound like a dumb question for a non-dentist, but I've drained 1,000 abscesses in my life. I've never encountered one that didn't smell. I didn't smell anything. How do you know you got into what the problem was? And again, I'm very naive. Maybe a dental abscess isn't supposed to smell. But he says, no, it's fine, it's done. I said, all right. So I leave his office, and like the next day, I'm in even more pain. So I call him back, and I say, Dr. So-and-so, I'm really in a lot of pain. And he says, no, it's fine. It just sometimes just takes a couple days to go away. I said, fine. The next day, I'm in like stupid amounts of pain. He says, all right, just come back in. So I come back in. So this time he does a sort of a panoramic one. He goes, oh, look, you have another root. Yeah, that's probably where the abscess was. I'll go back and get this one. I'm like, I really want to strongly encourage you to yank this goddamn tooth out. Like, I really don't care, but I have to go to New York in 3 days, and I can't be playing patty cakes with tooth pain. And he goes, no, we definitely got it. So he drills the second root. And I'm like, I still didn't smell anything. I don't know why I'm relying on the sniff test, but if Osler could drink urine to diagnose diabetes, I should be able to smell my abscess. So, nothing. He's like, no, it's definitely fine. The next day, I'm like, calling him back. I'm like, it hurts just as much, if not more. He goes, all right, let's do some clindamycin. I'm like, I'm starting to lose faith in the system here, right? So I do a patch of clindamycin. So I remember that Saturday night. I was going to New York on the Monday. That Saturday, I was in so much pain that we had to go to a dinner function, and I tried so hard to get out of it, but I was like the person that the dinner was for, so I couldn't really get out of it. So, I just sort of went, but as my wife put it, I was even more antisocial than I normally am. I'm highly antisocial, by the way. I was even more antisocial than I normally am. All I did was sit in a corner and do this the whole time. And these poor people just wanted to ask me all these questions, and I just, answering questions with grunts and nods. So, sure enough, on the next week, the Tuesday, I am going to New York, but so I get on the plane. Now, you have to understand something. The other thing I forgot to mention was the pain had gotten so bad I couldn't sleep. So basically, anytime I laid down, my head felt like it was going to be shot off my neck like a cannon. So I basically had to sleep on the couch sitting up with my head supported on a pillow, and that isn't really great sleep. So I'm like, this has been going on for 2 weeks now. I'm like delirious, right? So I get on this plane to go to New York for, at the time, what was the single most important meeting I was probably going to have that year. And I remember, I'm flying out of San Diego, I get on the plane, and literally it was the first time in a while I just fell asleep. And it was amazing. So I don't remember the takeoff, but I do remember what happened when we hit about 14,000 feet, which is my head literally, well, not literally, but it seemed like literally exploded. That pressure differential, I thought I was going to die. And I'm looking at the flight attendant, and I'm thinking, can I make a case for them to land this plane right now? Because I don't even, I haven't brought pain medicine with me or anything. I'm just thinking, what? So that flight to New York was, ridiculous. So I land in New York. In the taxi, I'm calling my dentist, and I said, look, it's Tuesday or Wednesday. I'm going to be back on Friday. My flight lands at 11. I'm coming straight to your office to have this tooth pulled out. He's like, okay, I got it. So now I'm thinking, okay, you just have to get through the next 3 days and one more flight, and you are set. So the Wednesday, I get up and I have a very important meeting it's with the head of philanthropy for JP Morgan Chase. So we're up in the private wealth banking suite of JP Morgan Chase at 450 Park Avenue. And it's me and a bunch of very important people. And we're sitting there, and they're asking me all the questions, right? Because I'm the guy that they're asking about this philanthropy deal. So they're asking me this, they're asking me that. And I'm in a suit and tie, as are the other men in the room, and the women are in their appropriate things. And I notice they're all looking relatively comfortable. And yet I feel like I'm in a sauna. And so I hope nobody noticed I'm going to loosen my tie. And then I keep looking at them, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm sweating over here like there's no tomorrow. What's going on? And now I'm having a hard time hearing the questions. You know, like the lady asks me a question, and I'm looking at her like I'm drunk. And then all of a sudden, I feel like really nauseous. So I said, I love that you're laughing the hardest, by the way, Gary. So I said, Jackie, do you have a bathroom I can use? And she says, yes, it's right around the corner. Now you gotta remember, all these people are just here to ask me a bunch of questions. So in my absence, they're kind of twiddling their thumbs. So I go into this bathroom, and I proceed to vomit in a manner that I think most college kids have never vomited. Right? So it's not, sorry to get grotesque, but you guys can handle it. It's not like I'm picking up the toilet seat going, it's like I am vomiting so forcefully that I have to put both my hands on the back of that toilet to prevent my head from shooting off the back. And I'm like projectile vomiting, and it starts out with blood, which of course, it's coffee ground emesis from all the ibuprofen I've been taking for the past 2 weeks. And after like 4 really amazing projectile explosive vomits, I'm like, all right, I think I'm all right now. And the best part of this, if I deserve credit for one thing, no vomit on the tie, because I managed to like put the tie under my arm while I was puking. So the scary thing is I go to wash my hands and I realize that I got a whole bunch of petechial hemorrhages from the pressure. So I have 2 black eyes. So I'm like, so now I have to, so I walk back in the room and I'm like, look, I'm sick. And they said, are you okay? And I said, like they think I got beat up in the bathroom. And I said, no, I am okay, but I'm sick. I just want you to understand. They said, well, should we just cancel the meeting? I said, no. I'm definitely good now. They said, okay. So we start talking again. 5 minutes later, the same thing happens. I'm like, can I use your bathroom again? I go back in there 7 more times. I projectile vomit over like a 10-minute period. It's now clear. So we went from blood to bile to nothing. Now I am literally just retching nothing. And now I look in the mirror again. My eyes are almost swollen shut. So I walk back into the office and I said, you know, maybe we should cancel the meeting today. And they said, absolutely. And I said, do you know any good oral surgeons? And they said, absolutely. We have a concierge practice for all of our clients. And they were amazing. They just like got on the phone. They found some guy 4 or 5 blocks away who could see me right away. So I said, fantastic. And this was like, I don't know if any of you went to New York this year. This is the worst weather New York, I think, has ever had since like New York was created. It was really bad. So I have to go see this guy right now because I've got 3 other meetings that afternoon. So I shuffle. I'm not even walking. I'm shuffling down Park Avenue in the snow, in so much pain, like completely dehydrated. I get into this guy's office, and he lays me down in the chair, and I say, I forget his name, but I said, Dr. So-and-so, that tooth needs to be pulled out now. He goes, are you sure? I said, oh, I'm sure. He goes, do you want me to do a check? I said, no. Just pull it out. He said, okay, how do you want to be sedated? I said, I don't want to be sedated. I have a meeting in an hour. You just have to pull it out right now. I don't want any lidocaine. I just want you to grab that MFing tooth and pull it out. And he's got this amazing Russian nurse who is like stronger than me, and you can just tell she is loving what she's about to see. So she's kind of holding me down, and I'd never had a tooth pulled out before. I didn't realize how unelegant this is. He literally just takes a set of pliers, cracks the crown, grabs the thing, and then does this, and all I see for the next 25 minutes is, and he's like almost on my chest. He's like, you've got really long roots. And and I admit it hurt like hell, but let me tell you something. The second that tooth came out, I knew we had done the right thing. I mean, I felt worse from a trauma standpoint, but so my cheek was now swollen out to here, and I'm bleeding like there's no tomorrow. So then he says, all right, I want you to go back to your hotel and just pack this for the next day. And I said, dude, I've got a meeting in like 30 minutes. He's like, all right. So he gave me like a bunch of cups to spit blood into, a bunch of little packing things. And so now I'm 2 black eyes, jaw out to here, cup in hand. I am walking to next meeting, just and I go into and I had to do these 3 next meetings with people who had never met me before. And it was sort of like, do you say anything or just hope they don't notice? I kind of went with a hope they don't notice. And that night, I actually ended up vomiting one more time that day just from all of it. But that night I went to bed. It was the first night I'd slept in 2.5 weeks. And I woke up the next morning, and it was amazing. It's like I'd had 7 hours of sleep. And I woke up in the morning, and of course, I'd been drooling the whole night. The pillow at this hotel, all blood. It was like the worst thing. Anyway, the story gets worse, but that's the punchline. And it was like, after that, I was like, I am never trusting another dentist again who just kind of wants to like swap a filling or something like that. And then the other thing was, and maybe this is incorrect, but my own personal philosophy now is, if I ever have a problem with a tooth again, I think I just want to have it pulled out from the beginning. I mean, in fact, I'm not even sure why we have teeth. I mean, is there any movement in the field to just prophylactically remove teeth immediately and replace them with stainless steel? Seriously. All right.
Peter, how was the fundraising?
Actually, it was pretty good on that trip. I think I got some sympathy votes on that trip. So, okay, well, with that, we'll talk about the healthcare system. My interest in this topic started actually a little bit, obviously, when I was in my medical training, but I think it became something I became more interested in when I was at McKinsey & Company, because I spent both my time in the corporate risk practice, which was mostly working for banks doing credit risk modeling, but also in the healthcare sector. And one of the first questions I had when I showed up was, I hear that we spend a lot of money on healthcare in the United States, but I have no idea how or why or where. So I was like, hey, does anybody have a P&L for this system? And the answer was always like, no, not really. It doesn't work that way. It's kind of complicated. And it was like, huh. Right off the bat, that's sort of a bad sign. Like when you're spending nearly $3 trillion on something and it's not clear where the money's going, or if it is, but you're not really, it becomes problematic. But rest assured, we've resolved that. So I'm going to share with you what that looks like. That said, this is a super complicated topic. It's certainly no less complicated than the last topic we got into. And the last topic, as you could tell, we only scratched the surface of. So we're certainly only taking not a 30,000-foot view, but what I'd probably call sort of a 130,000-foot view of this problem. So let's just start with the sort of obligatory fact set. So this is a country that's enjoyed an amazing increase in economic prosperity over the past 60 years or 50 years, as evidenced by the green line. But unfortunately, during that same period of time, our spending on healthcare has increased at a far greater rate. So that means that our spending on healthcare as a share of our economic wealth has grown disproportionately. I hope you will accept on face value my assertion that that is not sustainable indefinitely. So how does it actually look? Well, these are actually dated numbers. This is 2009. Unfortunately, the number is worth today. But one way to slice this problem up is to ask, how much money do we spend per person on healthcare? And of course, you want to do this against your OECD peers. I mean, it's not particularly interesting when we compare ourselves to Liberia. But it should be interesting to compare ourselves to Australia, Japan, the UK, Canada, et cetera. And so even amongst our economic peers, we spend significantly more money per person than them. And by the way, today the number is actually about $9,000 per person per year. That's a pretty big increase, but you have to remember these data are artificially low because what was going on in 2009? Right, the worst recession since the Depression. And so we actually saw healthcare spending stall during that period of time, but now it's back in full force. So what do we get for all that money? You know, look, at the end of the day, the problem with most healthcare discussions and debates is they're really all about black and white, and I'm going to try to dispel some of that today. But you should never really just argue that the cost of something is too great without weighing out the cost benefit of it, right? And so what do we get for our cost? Would it be worth spending $9,000 per person per year on healthcare if nobody ever got sick and if everybody got health coverage? And yeah, I think most of us would say, yeah, it would be. But what do we get? Well, we get 48 million Americans who are uninsured, 60 million Americans that don't have a usual source of care. And by the way, where do those people go for their care? Yeah, what does that do to healthcare costs? Yeah. And what percentage of Americans delay or avoid treatment due to the cost? 32 million. And what does that do to long-term care? Drives up the cost. So at the surface, we're certainly not getting a lot of bang for our buck. Furthermore, and this is the part that really kind of just drove me absolutely crazy once I started to understand the system, the cost of healthcare is a shell game. It's basically, I mean, you have more price transparency at the Lebanese carpet store than you do with, I mean, you talked about getting the bill for $500,000 being in the hospital for a month. I can assure you that if you lived, if everything else was the same and you lived in a different state, that bill would have looked different. Now, I get that cherries should cost more in one state than another because you have to ship the cherry, you know, this far versus that far. But when, it's very hard for me to explain this discrepancy. So what this graph is showing you is the top line is basically the average initial bill for the most expensive inpatient procedure by state, and the blue shows you what the Medicare reimbursement is. In other words, Medicare has basically said, we're just paying a flat fee. We don't really care where you are. But the hospitals are still playing this game of, well, we're going to charge different things to different people, and we'll make it up for it on different ends. And so what you don't even see in here, because it becomes so complicated, is that payers will reimburse at different rates. So by the way, the person who gets screwed the hardest is the self-pay. Right? You have no negotiating power whatsoever. So if you want to pay cash for a procedure, you know, you want to go and have a major operation, I mean, you are the favorite patient of a hospital. Unbelievable how much money is made on a cash patient. And it's a subsidy. You have to subsidize. So you could argue Medicaid is paying, of course, below Medicare. They might actually be losing money on those things. So you have a multi-tiered system of payment. All right. So because we're going to focus on healthcare, I think it's worth putting it in perspective. I remember during an election, and again, I don't want to make this political because this is actually not about one party versus another. But I remember during a recent election, I think it was the 2008 election, I was talking with somebody about, you know, well, what are your thoughts about McCain versus Obama? And the person was saying that they favored McCain, which again, I don't think that's right or wrong one way or the other, but their argument was what made me think of this story. Their argument was his position on stem cell research. No, it was on like abortion or something like that. And I said, look, I don't particularly care to have that discussion, but I'm not sure, if you remember what was going on in November of 2008, like when we were literally about to implode our economy, it was sort of like, I'm not sure we have the luxury of caring about abortion at this moment relative to some of the other things that matter. So I'd want to believe that we're picking our politicians more based on their ability to avoid icebergs than their ability to serve surf and turf versus casserole on the Titanic, right? Like there's, so what I would argue is there are a handful of economic icebergs that are potentially catastrophic. And so what are they? So there are probably three things, and it's really a great exercise to look at the United States budget. right? Meaning like, what is the budget of this country? People talk about the deficit. Oh, the deficit's a horrible problem, blah, blah, blah. Okay, great. What are we spending money on? These are the three things. You know the 80-20 principle, right? Like the 80-20 principle at its finest is, what are the things we really spend money on? It's healthcare, it's entitlement, and it's defense. So let's look at what's happening with each of those. So not only is healthcare the largest, but the point is its rate of increase is the largest. When your first and second derivative are both the largest for one problem, that's the problem I'd worry about the most. So while I do think entitlement issues are important and need to be resolved, while I do think pension overhead is an enormous problem that will be catastrophic, to many places it already is, Detroit, Chicago, there's a lot of places that are already in a heap of trouble. When you think about the total calamity of this nationally, I'm having a hard time seeing a problem on the horizon that is closer to us than the healthcare spending problem. Okay, so why is this problem so hard to solve? This problem, I would argue, is very hard to solve because most people don't understand the process of optimization. Now, admittedly, I'm biased because I'm an engineer, and engineers love optimization problems. We live in a world of local and minimal mins and maxes and this, that, and the other thing. But it's hard to do that on a sort of personal level. But let's try. So this is just my framework. So I'm not a sophisticated healthcare economist or anything like that. So I'm sure there are far more sophisticated systems. But my view is that there are basically three axes along which we should consider optimization. The first is access, right? In an ideal world, if you were starting from first principles, I think we would want to have a healthcare system where the greatest majority of people had access to care. Okay. The second is quality. If you were designing a system from first principles, I think you would want to provide the best quality care imaginable. It's not enough if everyone has access to the system if the system sucks or the healthcare you get is suboptimal. Finally, I think the third axis here is one of cost. If you can provide the best access in the world and you can provide the best quality in the world, but the cost is $1 million per person per year, it doesn't make sense. So how can you optimize around cost, access, and quality? Now, this is probably how we stack up today. I think it's safe to say that in the United States, our access is reasonable, but not great, and certainly nowhere near that of our OECD peers. In other words, if you live in Canada or in the UK or in Australia, you probably have more, on average, you have more access to healthcare, not at the individual level. In the United States, as you know, it's highly disparate. There are many people who have virtually no access to healthcare, and there are people who have the most remarkable access to healthcare. But on average, we're not that great on the access. I think the United States is, on average, the highest in quality, and probably, and that's debatable. What's probably not debatable is at the individual level. At the individual level, if you can buy it, you get the best healthcare in this country. And look, I don't remember the last time I met somebody who went over to Europe for their health care when they were a billionaire. But they all come here. When you've got an obscure diagnosis, you're coming to the United States. So certainly at the pinnacle, the United States has the best quality of health care. It's debatable on average if it's the best. You could argue that there are other countries that do a better job. Certainly they do dollar per dollar, but it's not clear in the absolute. But on the cost axis, as I think I've already demonstrated to you, we are amongst the worst of our peers. We are the worst by a country mile amongst our peers. Okay, so that's the situation today, and it appears nobody's happy about it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Okay, so this is how we think about the problem. We look at this and we say, we're not happy. We want this. Now, nobody shows you this graph when they say it, but you've heard the rhetoric, right? Like you've seen the political discussion. That's basically what they're saying. We have this, it's not good. Must have this. Okay. I'm here to tell you that's metaphysically impossible. You can't, I don't think you can do this. I don't think you can reduce the cost by 50%, increase the access, and dramatically increase the quality. I could be wrong. I think the closest you can, and I won't tell you where I think we can or can't get. I have feelings about which of these levers you have more to go with. But I will say that until you at least think about it through this lens, we're pretty much going to get nowhere. So this is where it's got us. So lots of talk, lots of rhetoric, lots of political BS, but no one's really having the sort of, what I think is the sort of critical discussion around what are the trade-offs we're willing to make. For example, would we be willing to spend just as much as we're spending now without increasing it if we could increase quality and access? That's a discussion that probably is worth having. Are we willing to reduce the cost without reducing quality or access? That's a question. So, all right. So today I want to focus on kind of what I sort of think of as two bookends of this problem. The patient interaction, which is at one end of the spectrum, and then the other one is kind of the structural problem. And I'll just tell you right now, I'm going to spend probably a little bit more time on the structural problem because I actually think that's the more interesting problem. I think the patient interaction, I will share with you a couple of stories that I think are critical for physicians and as healthcare providers. I think I share these as anecdotes to help you think about how you deliver care, because at the end of the day, the structure, the metastructure is sort of what allows the system to function, but technically healthcare is really mostly about an interaction between a provider and a patient. That's the interaction that governs most people's perception of healthcare, but what most people don't see is the payer and the provider relationship and the payer and the patient relationship and all these other things. But and that's unique, I think, to all countries. What is really interesting, and again, the part I really want to talk about, is the structural thing, because that's kind of unique to the US problem. And by the way, I will argue that the current structural problem prohibits change, meaningful change. So the structure has to be fixed, and if we can do that, I think we've got a shot at this. So lesson number one, and it's funny, when I was putting this talk together, I'd never for a moment envisioned I would tell you guys that dental story. So I'm about to tell you another great story about my life, which is when I was in my my fourth year of medical school. I was doing a sub-I rotation in the ICU. You know, you're in your beginning of your fourth year, you're starting to apply to residencies and stuff like that. And one day, I just was on my bike riding to the gym, and I noticed my back was sort of hurting a little bit. And I was kind of like, that feels weird. And so I got to the gym, and I got off my bike, and I locked it up, and I started walking towards the door, and I said, not only does this hurt, but this hurts more than I've ever felt pain in my back in my life. I mean, everyone's had a backache here and there. So I just decided actually wasn't going to continue working out. So I got on my bike, and I rode home. And that night, I went to bed, and the next morning I got up, and I couldn't get out of bed. So I actually had to call my roommate. We had two separate phones in our dorm room or whatever we lived in. And I actually had to call him to get me out of bed so I could go to the bathroom. And I realized there was no way I was going to make it into the hospital that day. So I called my chief resident and I said, hey, I can't even really move. And he says, that's fine. So, I figured it would be fine the next day. The next day it wasn't fine. The third day I finally managed to get in, but I was in so much pain that, and because I was in the ICU, I was able to get the nurses to give me so I just got them to inject a bunch of Toradol into me. Toradol is a really potent NSAID. And so that kind of alleviated the pain a little bit, but just like the experience I had with that dental abscess, I couldn't sleep. The pain was so bad. And the only position that seemed to alleviate the pain was being bent 90 degrees at the waist. So I did find that if I laid a pillow on the nurse's station, I could fall asleep bent into an L shape, sort of. But as things always happen, it's like a great example of sort of putting your head in the sand. I think most reasonable people in this situation would have thought about an MRI. I was just so fixated on doing well on the sub-I that I didn't want to leave the ICU, and I was working my tail off. And over the next week, it just really degenerated. So it went from just being horrible lower back pain to radiating pain down my left leg, so much so that it was beyond sciatica. It was also sort of a nerve pain where it felt like the bottom of my foot was being torn off. The skin was being torn off my foot. And so I came up with another, and again, these things sound idiotic when they're told in retrospect. So this story sounds comical now. At the time, everything I'm telling you seemed like a very logical solution. So the solution at the time to the feeling that my foot was being skinned was if you got a bag of ice and put your foot in it, you could numb your foot, and if you took enough Benadryl, you could put yourself into a coma. You could actually sleep for 4 hours till the ice melted and the pain woke you up, and then you just got another bag of ice, and then you would do it again. And so this sort of worked. At the time, I had forgotten in pharmacology the lesson of what taking 200 milligrams of Benadryl a day does to a person, which is it starts to induce psychosis. So, and this became evident when every dream I started having became more and more vivid and more violent of my own death. Like I would have dreams of jet skiing into concrete walls and stuff. I mean, it was really disturbing. And so about 2 weeks into this ridiculous episode, I'm limping through the hospital, and the dean of the medical school sees me. And he says, "Peter, what's going on?" And I said, "Oh, Dr. Wolf, I'm good. Just back's a little sore." He goes, "You don't look good." I said, "Well, complicated story." He grabbed me and took me to the ER. Because we're at Stanford. I mean, like, you can just walk down the hall and you're in the emergency room. And so I go to the emergency room, and the doctor examines me, and he says, "You're effed. We need to do an MRI immediately." So they did an MRI immediately. And he comes out of the scanner with his eyes the size of saucers, and he's like, "You have an entire fragment of your disc has broken off and gone down your canal. You've ruptured a disc, and it's now sitting on your S1 nerve root. That's explaining the pain." I said, "Good. I wasn't making this up. I feel good." So he says, "You know, this is a surgical emergency now. You're starting to lose motor function, so we need to get you to the OR quickly." So I said, "Great." Now, again, classic example of stupid behavior. I just called my buddy. I just called my buddy, and I said, "Hey, man, like, I kind of need to have this thing whacked out of my back, but I'd really like to do it right now. Who do you think should do it?" He goes, "Oh, so-and-so should do it." So he recommended his buddy, this neurosurgeon at Stanford, who admittedly was the neurosurgeon spine guy. But I didn't do my homework, which was who's technically the best spine surgeon at Stanford. I would have, if I'd done that, found out that it was a different guy. So, and again, I don't think this could happen today, but certainly back in this day when it was loosey-goosey, before HIPAA showed up and before JACO was warming the halls, I just went down to the OR. The guy never met me. He never I didn't meet the surgeon. I just went straight into surgery. And I woke up a few hours later. They showed me this picture, which was the 4-centimeter fragment of disc that they had taken out of my back. And they said, "You're all good." And I said, I don't feel good. In fact, everything prior to surgery was on the left side of my body, but now I can't move my right foot. And I found out later that they went in on the wrong side initially. They went in on the right side, dinged the right nerve. That's why I had a right foot drop. And it turned out that they hadn't got everything out of the left side because they were doing it minimally invasively. So the next day I go home, but again, I'm sort of like, man, something doesn't feel right. Like, I used to be able to walk, but now I can't walk because foot drop is when the nerve that holds your foot up is injured. It's sort of funny. If you try walking and imagine that your foot is limp, you can't walk because your toe just drags, and it's actually really dangerous. So now I have that thing going on, plus I'm still in horrible pain. And so I got the burning foot on the left, the thing on the right. And so I go back to see the surgeon 2 days later, and I tell him I'm not feeling sweet, and he says, "Suck it up, man. Don't you want to go into surgery, son? Like, suck it up. You are fine. Get out of here. I don't want to see you again." So I said, "Okay, what do I know?" And so I'm sucking it up for a week, getting no better, getting worse. A good friend of mine comes over who's doing his rotation in neurology. And, you know, like every diligent medical student. He's carrying around his little reflex hammers. He comes over, he does an exam on me and says, "You have no reflexes left from below the waist." I don't know anything about neurology, but I know that's not good. So he says, he goes, "You need to come in and see my attending tomorrow." So the next day, I get at this point I can't drive, I can't do anything. So I get a lift into the hospital, I go and see his attending, very kind woman, and she does the exam, confirms his findings. She takes me back to the MRI scanner, and she says, we do the MRI, and sure enough, there's still a dominant fragment sitting on the left-sided root. So she calls the neurosurgeon, gets him to come down right away, and says, "This kid needs to go back to the OR now." So I went back to the OR that night. Same guy. Sure, same guy. This time he does a much bigger operation. So bilateral complete laminectomies, cleans out everything. And so sure enough now, all the fragments are gone. The foot drop is going to resolve. But post-op, I'm not getting better. I'm still getting worse. But now it's a different pain. So the burning foot thing is actually going away. Technically when you injure a nerve, the pain doesn't get better immediately because the nerve is injured. So what happens is you go from constant pain to intermittent pain to less intermittent pain. In fact, 17 years later, to this day, I will still get that pain of flesh being torn off my foot maybe once a month, and it only lasts 3 or 4 seconds. But it may never actually forever go away, but at the time, you knew that was moving in the right direction because it went from every minute to like a couple minutes every hour. But now I was developing a new pain that seemed hard to explain at the time, which was kidney pain and testicular pain, which you'd think like, how does that make sense? But what I learned eventually, and by the way, this pain went on for like a month and a half. And this pain was so bad that my mom actually had to fly down from Toronto, where I grew up, because I couldn't feed myself. Now I was like sort of floor-ridden. I couldn't lay in a bed because the bed was too soft. Like the only thing I could do was lay on a floor and be like hand-fed. I mean, it was really bad. So at this point, this was sort of like, I refer to this as sort of the darkest chapter of my life, right? Because, it's funny now to tell the story. It was anything but funny at the time, right? This was sort of like, your expectations just go down. And like my highest expectation was I want to be the best surgeon in the world. So to do that, I have to go to the best surgical residency in the world, and that's what I'm gunning for. And then that became to, okay, that's not going to happen this year, maybe eventually, to, okay, I'm not going to be able to be a surgeon because obviously I won't be able to stand. I hope I can be something else. And then that turned into, I'm probably never going to walk again. And it sounds dramatic because it would only been 2 months, but it was 2 months where I was basically stranded by the system. Like I went back to see this doctor even after the second operation, and he was now dismissing me as sort of crazy. And now even my mom is yelling at the guy. The footnote to that story, by the way, is that guy ended up getting busted for fraud. So he was illegally billing Medicare and illegally bringing, he was Korean. He brought a bunch of Korean observers to Stanford and then actually let them operate. So he ended up getting fired. So I was a little vindicated that this guy was literally just as much of a shady guy as I thought he was. But nevertheless, at the moment, there was no salvation in that. So the guy who actually stepped up and saved me was actually Steve Rosenberg, right? So Steve, even though I hadn't done my fellowship with him yet, as a medical student, I'd already gone and spent half a year with him. He had taken a huge interest in my career, and he was calling me all the time to see how I was doing. And I think finally, after 2 months, he'd had enough. And he just said, "Peter, I know you don't want me to do this because you don't want to make a fuss about this, but I'm calling the chief of neurosurgery now." 10 minutes later, he literally just paged the head of neurosurgery at Stanford. 10 minutes later, I got a call from my surgeon who said, "Come in and see me tomorrow. I'll do an x-ray." And so I went in, I saw him. He did an x-ray to confirm I didn't need a fusion, sent me off to see a guy that would be the guy that would end up fixing me. This was an anesthesiologist who specialized in pain management, who did a series of really interesting things that over the course of a year fixed me. But it began with an amazing story, not unlike the tooth being yanked out, where you're so desperate, you just don't care. And so I went to him, and he said, "Look, you have what's called a facet arthropathy, I suspect, which is you've lost so much disc space in your back that even though it's at the L5-S1 level, it's caused a realignment at T12 L1. And so all that pain you're feeling in your kidneys and your testicles is actually from those nerves. And so we have to calm the system down. So he said, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to inject 400 milligrams of lidocaine into you intravenously, which, for those of you doing the math, is the toxic dose for someone at my weight at the time. That's 5 milligrams per kilogram. And we're going to IV drip that into you over 20 minutes, put you on a cardiac monitor, so in case you go into VFib, we'll shock you. But the goal is to try to silence every sodium channel in your body. So we did that. Didn't work. So we said, okay. What we could do now is go to the OR, and we could do, they have these needles that are each about this big. We could inject Marcaine and steroid into each facet, each dorsal root, and each nerve in your back. And that will definitely stop the pain temporarily and at least let us begin a diagnostic process. I said, let's do it. He goes, well, here's the problem. It's 10 o'clock at night, and we don't have an anesthesiologist, so I can't give you any sedation to do that. So why don't we come back tomorrow and do it? And I said, no, just do it today. I don't need sedation. Just do it. He goes, I'm going to put 60 needles this long into your back with no sedation. You sure you want that? And I was like, dude, do you have any idea what I've been through in the last 2.5 months? Hell yes, I want you to do that. So we did it, and it was unbelievable. That was the first moment of reprieve. The pain went away. I actually got home that night at midnight. It was the first time I'd been able to walk. My mom was like, okay, let's go, get you to bed. I said, hell no. I walked around the Stanford campus till the morning. The amazing thing is I ended up developing a plantar fasciitis after because I hadn't walked in 2.5 months and then walked. So anyway, this story has a very happy ending, which is over the course of a year, I was able to, because of this guy, his name's Sean Mackey at Stanford, 13 more trips to the operating room, amazing rehab team. I mean, today, most people never know that I went through this because outside of the scars on my back, you wouldn't know this. And I think my back today is actually stronger than it was when I was 25 years old. Why is this story in here? During this episode, something really sinister happened to me that gave me one of the most amazing insights imaginable, and that was I became completely addicted to pain medication. So addicted, in fact, that I realized exactly when it happened when I stopped taking the oxycodone and OxyContin for pain. So, look, these are very important medications for people who are suffering, right? But you know that for many people there's a buzz that's associated with this disease. And at some point I became so depressed with my life that the buzz was the only thing that, there was the only thing to look forward to when you woke up was like, well, I'm going to get a buzz from this drug, so that's all I got today. And you build up a high tolerance to these things. So I was actually up to about 300 milligrams a day of oxycodone, which, as you know, those of you who prescribe this, that would kill 6 people if given at once. But I was just on this stuff all the time. Detoxing from that turned out to be hard. At the time, I was dating an anesthesiologist, and she was like watching me spiral out of control. And I said to her, Tara, I'm just going to quit cold turkey. And she said, you can't. I said, oh, no, I'll do it. She goes, no, let me put you on some nortriptyline. She came up with a whole cocktail of drugs that she'd taper me off. And I said, no, I'm just going to come off straight away. And she said, you're going to be depressed like, there are not words to describe the depths of the depression you're going to sink into. And I said, okay, let's give it a shot. And so we did. And boy, was she right. I mean, unbelievable. All I could think about was a score. All I could think about was how much I wanted another hit of that stuff. Now, this became interesting because in the end, I was able to graduate on time, miraculously. I was far enough ahead that I was able to graduate with my class. I took a leap of faith and continued to pursue an application to a surgical residency program and basically just assumed that my trajectory would continue until my internship started the following July. But what I ended up at Johns Hopkins, which is in Baltimore. And those of you who have watched The Wire or read The Coroner will know that Baltimore is the heroin capital of the United States. About 1/3 of people who come in the emergency room at Hopkins are addicted to heroin and have either HIV, Hep C, or Hep B. And for most surgical residents, the heroin-addicted patient is the bane of your existence because One, they're always coming in the middle of the night with some infected abscess, broken needle fragments inside their arms. You know, they could have come in at 2 in the afternoon, but of course they didn't. They came in at 2 in the morning. They wake you up, and you have to go down there, drain this thing while they spit at you and, you know, call you all sorts of names. I mean, it's just a very unpleasant thing. And for whatever reason, obviously because of my own experience with this, I had a really soft spot in my heart for those patients. They never got under my skin. They never pissed me off. It never upset me. I just had tremendous empathy for that patient who was addicted to heroin, because what I knew, even though I'd never tried heroin is, I forget the exact number, I want to say 100 times more stimulating on the mu receptor than oxycodone. So I knew the following. I knew what it felt like to need oxycodone more than anything in life, and I knew that whatever they were feeling was 100 times stronger for heroin. So I could at least relate that this is horrible. And so, at least for that segment of my residency, it was very easy for me to feel empathy on that patient population. So the lesson from that for me was, the more as a provider you can empathize with your patient, the better a doctor you will be. It doesn't always mean you can fix them, meaning you can have a patient that's got an abscess who's still going to die from the sepsis that ensues, but there's a big difference in how they die, right? Do they die with your judgment or do they die with your empathy? And I believe that actually makes all the difference in the world. So that was lesson 1. Now lesson 1, forgotten. Now I'm not going to tell the story, especially for the sake of time. Definitely not. But as alluded to during the introduction, that I gave a TED talk, a TED Med talk that is now featured on TED. I will just suggest, go and watch that talk. That's basically an example of, I learned a lesson and then I forgot it on a different problem. And it basically comes down to how the healthcare system interacts with overweight and obese and diabetic patients, which is basically a culture of profound judgment, right? So it stems from a belief that says, look, if you're overweight, you've done this to yourself. If you have diabetes, you've done this to yourself, right? And, you know, I just flash you a sampling of basically the literature on this, right? I mean, there's no secret about this. Physicians have, though physicians themselves are often overweight, physicians have a tremendous disdain for the overweight patient, the diabetic patient. The reason for this is, of course, that we believe these are behavioral diseases. We believe that overweight, obese, and diabetic patients have done this to themselves as though it were some conscious choice. As you can probably gather from the last talk, I don't share that belief anymore. I certainly did, and that's what I talk about in this TED Talk. But what I do believe is that the scientific community has largely failed the public on the whole, and what we're basically watching is, not at every level, there are certainly people that are making deliberately horrible lifestyle changes, trading short-term pleasure for long-term health. But for the most part, I actually believe what we're witnessing is a genetically susceptible population in an environment that's triggering disease. So you can watch that and you'll feel that out. But let's get to the part that I think is maybe more interesting and enlightening, which is the structural side of the US healthcare system. All right. Now, it's funny. It took me a long time to truly understand how the system worked. It's because it really is a black box, right? So it's a $2.8 trillion black box, meaning $2.8 trillion flows into and out of this system. So the first thing you have to understand is what's putting the money in, what's taking the money out. So basically the money goes in from 4 sources. The government. The government puts money in through 2 programs. Medicare, which is a program for the elderly, and Medicaid, which is a program for the poor. Private payers. What's a payer? A payer is your insurance company. Now the private payer, so I've distinguished private from government payer. The government is acting as a payer. CMS, Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, is a payer. But the private is like your Blue Cross, your Blue Shield, your Anthem, you know, United, Aetna, all those folks. Now, they don't always pay your health insurance. As I'll discuss in a few minutes, we have 2 different types of healthcare. We have 2 different types of insurance through a payer. Sometimes your employer is actually paying the cost, and the healthcare, the insurance company is just administering a service, and sometimes the actual risk is carried by the payer. So the thing to always ask your question about is who bears the risk? So if you are 70 years old, the government carries your risk. If you get sick, the government is paying. If you are poor, the government is carrying your risk if you qualify for Medicaid. If you are uninsured, you carry your risk. You are your own payer. If you are at a small company, your payer carries the risk. Because at a small company, the employer can't afford to cover the risk. So they're just paying into a pool, and the insurance company manages the risk. If you're at a large employer, your employer actually carries the risk. So if you work at Google, Google is actually carrying the risk. Even though your health insurance card says United, United doesn't carry any risk. They're just making a few dollars off you, sort of like a Visa card does. If you get sick, your employer is going to pay for it. Okay, so those are basically the 4 buckets that go into it. And then where does the money go? It goes to hospitals. It goes to providers specifically, so physicians that contract directly, so this is both inpatient and outpatient. It goes to pharma companies, medical device companies, DRE, so durable medical stuff. It goes to diagnostic tests, and it goes to labs. All right, this is the single most important 2 graphs of my life, which is what is the sources and uses of cash? Remember when I said, can somebody please show me the P&L of the US healthcare system? This is basically it. 41.7% of the money that enters that black box comes from the government. Medicare, Medicaid, and other sources of public funding. 38.2% of that comes from private insurance, which includes both the government, both the payer and the employer. We don't distinguish those here. So basically, it's 40-40, and then about 11% comes from consumer out-of-pocket, and 8.6 comes from a bunch of other small programs. Where does the money go? You guys are on here. Look, dental care, 4%. The money goes, about 70% of it goes to, you can see hospital care being the single largest, physician office and other professional services, okay? And then on the pharma side, you've got, and by the way, inpatient pharma is included in hospital. That's what makes these data so complicated to tease out. So medical device and inpatient pharma are lumped in the greens. Then you have outpatient pharma, outpatient medical device making up 13%. And then you have the actual cost of administering all this is 7%. And think about that, 7% of 2.8 trillion. You see why people get pissed about administration costs? That's a big cost. So let's revisit the problem statement. So I've just explained to you how $2.8 trillion enters the healthcare system, how $2.8 trillion exits the healthcare system. Let's revisit the problem statement. Today we are spending $9,000 per person per year in the United States on healthcare. We should just assert a goal. Right? We can't keep spending this much money. So what if we want to reduce that to, say, $5,000 per person per year to be in line with our peers? What would have to happen? Well, we'd have to put less money in and take less money out. Okay, this is where it gets interesting. How do other countries manage to keep their healthcare costs as low as they do? Why is Canada spending so much less than us? Why is the UK spending so much less than us? What's the fundamental difference? There's a more fundamental difference. All of those things are true. The fundamental difference is the structure of the system. In all countries but ours, for the most part, healthcare is budget driven. What that means is the federal government sets a budget at the beginning of the year that says this is how much we are spending on healthcare. Now, is that a perfect system? It is not. And I'll share with you what that looks like in a system where it goes wrong, right? So in Canada, I remember, because I was still living there at the time, they basically said, look, we're capping salaries on physicians. We're capping, and it was done by specialty. I mean, there was nuance to it. Obviously, a cardiac surgeon is going to make more than an internist. But the point is, If you were a urologist living in Toronto, I have no idea what the cap was, but it was X dollars. When you billed the Canadian insurance, the Ontario insurance system for those dollars, the moment you hit that, you couldn't make another dollar. So what kind of incentive does that provide? Well, I'll tell you what it meant. It meant a lot of docs worked 8 months a year, and by September, nobody was working anymore because you'd already hit your cap. You could make your cap in 8 months, and then you didn't work. So that's an extreme example of a budget-driven system. The United States is the exact opposite of that. It is a 100% demand-driven system. Think push versus pull. In the United States, it's the output that's driving the input, not the reverse. So every other country says we're fixing the input, output is what it is. The US says no, we're not going to fix anything. Let the output be what the output is, and the input will match to it. So two ends of the spectrum. I'm going to assert that neither is perfect, but the one we're in is devastating. Case in point, look at what we're doing. So what drives demand? So if we've established that it's a demand-driven system, then we need to know what's driving demand. Demand is driven primarily by two entities, the hospital and the provider. And remember, that's reflected in our P&L, which is how many of those dollars are actually being driven hospital providers. So what does that mean? Well, this is where it gets to some of the comments that have been made, right? More patients going through the system. Sicker patients going through the system, higher DRGs. So remember, I mean, and I say this, look, I'd say this openly if we were sitting with a bunch of hospital administrators. At the end of the day, hospitals make money the sicker you are, right? I mean, I talk with my friends who are, busily building clinical practices, and at the end of the day, their compensation is based on the DRG, the diagnosis-related group. The sicker your patient is, the more money you get paid. So, for example, a cardiac surgeon who's operating on somebody who's got a more complicated case than another person is going to get paid more. And that makes sense, right? I mean, you're taking a bigger risk. It's usually a harder person to take care of. But the point remains that our system is compensating us based on the sickness of the patient. Patients are staying longer in the hospitals. Procedures are being done more frequently. Unfortunately, there are a lot of unnecessary procedures. We'll talk a little bit about that. I think that is a problem that is very unique to the United States. And it's a political hot button, but I'm going to address it anyway. So if the answer is less sickness, less time in the hospital, fewer unnecessary procedures, you'd want to believe that somewhere in here there's a mechanism to compensate physicians or providers to avoid illness. And we all talk about that. That gets a lot of lip service. Has anybody ever heard of wellness programs? Right. Not particularly effective, are they? And they're not effective because they're not compensated effectively, right? So at the end of the day, the dollars drive the behavior. So when you don't pay a physician to inform their patient about, look, if you gave me an hour a week with a patient, I'm positive, and I don't just mean me because I'm anything special. I mean, if you gave a doctor who knew what they were talking about with respect to nutrition and all these other things, an hour per week with a patient for 6 months, could you fix their life? I think you could fix many people. I think you could actually generate an amazing ROI on that when you consider what you could save down the line. But it can't be done. The healthcare system will not compensate that, right? A physician has typically 6 to 10 minutes with a patient, and during that period of time, the imperative thing is to capture and record all of their DRGs and create a specific treatment plan. So again, problem number one, think demand-driven. Problem number two, think compensation is based on illness, not avoiding illness. This is a sensitive topic for people, especially my brother who's a lawyer, but I think my brother actually can't disagree with me on this. We have a tort problem in the United States. And it's very hard to study this technically. Meaning, so the opponents of the tort argument will say the following, and they're correct. When you compare healthcare costs in Texas with those in Pennsylvania, we do not see a significant difference. Why did I use those two states? Basically, you can put all US states into one of three categories, A, B, or C. A, are very, very favorable tort conditions for litigators, lawyers, and patients. B is intermediate states, and C are states that are highly favorable to the doctor and the hospital. Texas is a C state, very favorable, very hard to sue your doctor or hospital in Texas. Pennsylvania, Nevada are the opposite. Michigan, I mean, if your doctor looks at you wrong, you could probably get $1 million out of them. California is a B state. We're kind of in the middle. And it is true that at the surface, the difference in cost between an A state and a C state is relatively minor. I would argue, and I push back and say that actually that's because you can't capture, you're measuring the wrong thing. You're simply measuring the cost of litigation. That's the tip of the iceberg. That's not what is actually driving the cost. I asserted that back here. Nowhere on this list is litigation. What is on this list is procedures. And the question is, how many of those procedures are unnecessary? Now look, I realized this the day I started my residency, which was, how many things did we do to patients, how many tests did we order that were completely unnecessary, but we explicitly did because we wanted to avoid litigation down the line? Do anyone want to hazard a guess how many head CTs I ordered in people that I knew just had caffeine withdrawal? But what choice did I have? Because think about it this way. If I order the head CT on this guy, and it's going to be negative, I've covered myself because the statute of limitations on that is like, I don't want to have to ever think about it again. I don't want to have to worry that in 4 years I get served a subpoena because I missed an aneurysm in a guy 4 years ago. I'm not paying for the CT scan. I realize, and believe me, we would sit around and argue about this all day long because you felt like you were doing something wrong. You felt like you were just flushing money down the toilet, ordering all of these goofy, unnecessary tests that had no bearing. They exposed patients to unnecessary risk, unnecessary radiation, enormous cost to the system. But you did it because I wasn't getting radiated more. I wasn't going to have to pay for it, but I got to walk away and never have to think about it again. And so study after study has found that 20 to 30% of the tests and procedures that are done on patients are deemed unnecessary by physicians, but are done purely for defensive reasons. Again, I don't know if this is something that applies in your field or not. If it is, it'd be an interesting lunchtime discussion. But I believe that the culture of tort in the United States is unlike anything I've ever seen. People often ask me when I tell that backstory, man, you must have sued the crap out of that guy. You know what's funny? I didn't. Never even crossed my mind. I attribute that in part because I grew up in Canada. You just don't sue people. You know, maybe I should have sued the guy, if for no other reason than to get the guy fired, which of course he ended up getting fired eventually. But the point was, I was just mostly fixated on getting better. Now, maybe I should have at least sued him to cover the medical costs I incurred, and I think that would have been entirely reasonable. But should I have sued him for pain and suffering? I don't know. But the point is, it didn't even occur to me, and it never occurs to people that hear this story who don't live in the United States. Yet it's the first question every American asks me, which is, oh, that's $1 million suit right there. And it probably was. I wish I had $1 million now, but at the end of the day, I don't think that's the answer. Right? I don't think that's the answer. So let's get to the key. Who's paying for this? So we've asserted what the government's doing. The government is paying. Today and tomorrow, the burden of this is being increasingly shifted to the employer. So again, let me reiterate how ASOs work and risk. In the payer landscape, if you look at the profit and loss statement or the income statement for pick Aetna or United or WellPoint, the biggest payers in the world, in the United States. They basically make money on two products. One is called ASO, one is called risk. ASO stands for Administrative Service Only. That's the service where large employers are bearing the risk, but they're transferring the administrative portion of that to the payer. So the ASO business is a low-margin, high-volume business. You sort of make about 7% margin on that, but you take no risk. The risk business is where the payer takes the risk. So because our employer, my employer, is small, it certainly could never afford to take the risk. You know, in a company of 10 people, if one person gets sick, it would wipe out the entire company. So, think about it. A $500,000 hospital bill could destroy a 10-person company, right? So So the actual risk is borne by the payer. We are seeing a shift to more and more employers carrying the risk. That's driven largely by the following. The employer believes it can better manage the cost. So when you are doing an ASO, you get no pricing. You get no pricing control with the payer. So if you are United and I am Joe Schmo company, and I come to you and I say, I've got 50 employees, I'd like them insured, you just tell me the price. I don't have any say, I just have to pay you that amount. You've baked in, obviously, a reasonable enough margin that you're not going to lose money because you're the expert on this, you're the actuary. You know how you'll make 5 to 6% on that, guaranteed. And that price keeps going up and up and up because the cost of providing health care is going up and up and up. So I'm not here to tell you that payers are evil. I think that's a really popular knee-jerk thing to say. The payers are evil. They're not actually evil. I'll tell you this, the margin made by your healthcare company is less than State Farm and Allstate, right? No, I don't see anybody saying that how much we hate State Farm for how much money they make insuring our cars or our houses. So what drives the premium is the service. So the payer's not responsible for the service. I hate my payer because they nickel and dime me over my prescription or whatever. But let's be clear on what they're doing that's driving us nuts versus not. They're not setting the price. They're simply an intermediary. And the employer is saying, wait a minute. If I'm paying this guy and every year it's going up 6%, and I have no say in that, and he controls the guy that's getting sick, I want, as the employer, to now manage that risk because I think I'll do a better job getting my employers to be healthier. And so that's where the employers are coming in. So we are seeing a risk transfer. We're seeing a transfer of risk from the employer, from the payer to the employer. So we are seeing a trend towards more and more of the ASO. So the only thing you really want to remember from all this is in tomorrow's world, you should think of employers and payers as basically the same. All right. Let's recap. This is a graph showing skin in the game by the size of the bar and driving of demand. So we've got 4 entities that we care about. The payer/employer, remember I told you they're all the same, and let's put the government in that category. So payer, employer, CMS. How much skin in the game do they have? Well, remember, our graph told us exactly how much they have, 81.2%. They're paying 81.2% of the rent. The patient, we pay 11.4% of the rent. The provider in the hospital, they do indirectly have to pay a little bit. Some insurance companies are clawing back on them if they make mistakes. So for example, if you get a bounce back readmission, Medicare is going to take some money back from you. So they got a little skin in the game. Operative word being little. Where's demand being driven by? It's on the right side of the graph, right? Okay. Does anybody think that's a reasonable system? Does anybody here taken like a 101 course on economics, like back in high school? It's funny. It's amazing to me that this is the U.S. healthcare system, and we are wondering how we got where we got. Let me come up with a couple of examples for what's wrong with this picture. Now, imagine for a moment. Anybody bought a car in the last couple months? Okay. Imagine you had an insurance plan that said, if you have this insurance plan, I will pay for 90% of the cost of your car. You have to pay 10% of the cost of the car. Would that alter your car buying decision? Would you still own the car you just bought?
Gary would, but nobody else.
So right out of the gate, we have a problem, right? Which is we're putting you and the car salesman, meaning the patient in the hospital, are making a decision for which 80% of the bill is being paid by somebody else. Very hard to make what we call rational economic choices under those settings. Very hard. Furthermore, I want to add another layer of complexity to that. When you bought your car, was it relatively easy for you to compare the features of that car to another car? For example, the cost of the car itself, the features that the car had, the safety record of that car, other things? I'm sure it was, right? I mean, I'm sure if you're anything like me, you at least wasted a solid day putting a spreadsheet together to compare your 3 choices. So you had tremendous transparency and insight into the products that you were selecting between. So you had skin in the game. You were paying the majority of it, not all of it, because you might get a loan. And if you get a loan, the bank you're spreading out your cost over time. They're probably throwing you some interest rate deduction. But you have a lot of skin in the game, and you have a tremendous ability to compare products. That's how rational economic decisions are made. When you take those 2 features away, there is no Band-Aid you can put on this system to fix it. Let me give you a more realistic example than the goofy car one. Anybody know what city this is? Close. It's Riyadh, capital of Saudi Arabia. So I was there a few years ago and stayed in that hotel, actually, which is, the picture doesn't do it justice. That hotel is the most unbelievable thing I've ever seen in my life. It's shocking. So, and I have a friend there, an American, who lives in Saudi Arabia 9 months of the year. So he leaves June, July, and August. So his name's Brad. So Brad, like, wow, I mean, what's that like, man? Like, you live in Riyadh. That's got to be crazy. Yeah. And I don't know how it somehow comes up that he says, yeah, so I leave in, I said, do you leave because it's really hot? He goes, yeah, it's really hot in the summer, and obviously Ramadan and stuff, you just want to be there. Okay, great. So it somehow comes up in the conversation that when he leaves his apartment at the end of May, he leaves his air conditioning on full tilt. And then when he comes back in September, his air conditioning is still on, full tilt. And I was like, dude, I am such a cheapskate. Like, I never use air conditioning. How can you afford to do that? He goes, it costs $5. I was like, what? He goes, yeah, you forget how subsidized energy is in Saudi Arabia. I mean, how do you think they keep the peace around here? And it's true. I mean, 95 octane gasoline in Saudi Arabia is about 15 cents a gallon. They don't have sidewalks in Saudi Arabia. They literally don't have sidewalks. Why? Who would walk? 95 octane. We can't even get 95 octane in this country. I just paid $4.24 for 91 octane the other day. 15 cents. So similarly, their utility bill, they don't have utility bills. They don't have it. It's a subsidy. It's a program to placate the population to keep the peace. But the point I want to make is, when you don't have skin in the game, I said to him, but Brad, don't you just feel bad morally wasting that much energy? And he said, but Peter, do you have any idea how hot it is when if I didn't turn the air conditioning on, it would take like 6 hours to cool my apartment when I showed back up in September. I mean, it's a disconnect. And he's not a bad guy. I'd probably do the same thing if I lived there. The point is, you can't make a rational economic decision when you're put in a system where you're detached from the cost. Use one more example. I call it so I'm very interested in risk, obviously. So the natural ownership of risk is this concept I keep coming back to. And I'm asserting, of course, that the natural owner of the risk in the healthcare system is the patient and the provider hospital, not the payer. The payer, the employer, the government, should not be the one bearing the dominant risk. I realize it's fashionable to say they should, but I'm telling you, any time in history I've ever seen an example where the person driving demand and the entity providing it aren't the ones holding at least some of the risk, it never ends well. And yet we sit here and scratch our heads that the system isn't doing well. Airlines have the single greatest exposure to them on their cost list is fuel, right? So what have some of them done in response to that? They have hedged fuel prices. And everybody hails this as the greatest breakthrough in the history of managing flight risk. And everybody loves to point out that in the summer of 2008, Southwest was making a killing because they had hedged fuel prices to be lower. They had hedged at a lower price when fuel prices skyrocketed. If you recall, in July of 2008, we hit an all-time high at $147 per barrel, and Southwest was in at a $50 a barrel price. So Southwest was making money hand over fist. The interesting thing is most people don't realize the footnote to that story, which is in December, in the fourth quarter of that very same year, Southwest tanked on that bet because fuel prices were down to $38 a barrel and they were hedged higher. So the point is, and again, risk people would argue this all day long. Should airlines be hedging fuel or not? I'm not going to get into that debate. What I will say is the purest argument is probably not, because they're not the natural owners of that risk. They're the natural owners of safety, logistics, customer. Like, there are things that they control the risk around because it's their core competency. Fuel pricing, not one of them. So it turns out, if you do an analysis on this, which some have done, airlines are more likely to lose money than make money if they hedge that risk. Again, they're not the natural owner of the risk. So never forget this idea, who's the natural owner of the risk in our healthcare system? That's the one who needs to be holding it. All right, so to wrap up, to reiterate, there are two things that have to happen for the US healthcare system to be fixed. And I would argue most people are fixated on number two, which I think is necessary but not sufficient. And most people never want to talk about number one because it's really politically incorrect. Step one is we must have a philosophical change about who carries the risk. Today, the risk is almost exclusively carried by the payer, meaning the employer, the insurance company, the government. Tomorrow, if we have any chance of fixing this system, we have to transfer that risk to the hospital and the provider and the patient. That trio must carry the lion's share of the risk somehow. The second step, which does get a lot of traction, but unfortunately at the exclusion of the former, is we need a new set of tools to compare and contrast. Because if you are going to pass on the risk to the patient, they must be able to do what this gentleman probably did last month when he bought his car, which is make rational decisions about trade-offs of features. Think about it. I mean, my wife calls me an e-shopaholic because I'm always, like, I hate going to stores. So anything I buy, I'm buying online. And so if I'm buying it online, like, why not do a comparison? Like, I'm just obsessed with comparing stuff. Like, even if I'm buying underwear, like, I kind of want to know if Calvin Klein or American Apparel is better. Like, let's find out. And so we can do this for anything. Like, we can compare anything we buy. We can find out how much does it cost? What are the features? What are the trade-offs? What's the upside? What's the downside? And yet, the one thing we spend more money on as a society than anything else, and I can say that without hyperbole, we spend more money on healthcare than anything else. We have no insight into what it costs, why it costs, what the economic trade-off is. So until we fix those two problems, unfortunately, I think we're screwed. The good news is, being screwed, I think, forces you to reconsider things. And it is my sincere hope that in time, as the water gets a little warmer, people will start to revisit these uncomfortable questions about what is it we're optimizing for in healthcare? Is it access? Is it quality? Is it cost? And in what proportions? And how do we fix it? And that's it. Thank you very much.
Just to use your personal example, I'm very interested in your perspective on your ability to compare. In your dental example, you went into your dentist. He said, we need to replace these fillings. You'd be better off if we replace these fillings. Was this paid for by an insurance company, or did you pay for yourself for that?
Great point. I think the entire discussion started because he commented on how nice my insurance plan was.
Let me ask you this, then, knowing what you know, and saying you want to be accountable for some of this risk, how would you go about finding out as a patient whether that was a smart thing to do or not? How would you do that?
So the first thing I did when I switched dentists in San Diego was, because I basically had two pretty bad dental experiences. I knew a former dentist who basically left dentistry to start a hedge fund, and I said, who's your dentist? In other words, I sort of figured I should really go to the dentist of a dentist. Presumably he's smarter than me. So that was really what I did. Now, so that's the first question, which is how would I choose my physician or my care provider? I'm not sure that that's a great option. I mean, I think the challenge with physician selection is that we don't yet have a good way to do a comparison. So I'll use the one thing I know the most about, which is cardiac surgery, just because the metrics are so tangible. So as you guys know, some states mandate by law, New York was the first state to do this, that for any cardiac surgeon in New York, you have to be able to publish your mortality rates. And that at the surface sounds really good, right? Like, your dad needs heart surgery and he's going to Sinai Hospital. Let's at least find out who's killing the most people. What's the problem with that analysis? You got it. What does it do? It penalizes the people who are taking care of the most challenging patients. Yeah. So I'm sure that we could come up with a very, like, I'm sure the same is true in endodontistry, right? Which is, who's got the biggest, double taps and all these sorts of other things? Well, it's got to be there are probably some of you among here who are like the apex predators. Like, though you get the case, like you get the third time redo, that's a nightmare. And so should we really be comparing you to so the answer is clearly that's too simple. And this comes really into the tools to objectively assess. The good news is there's more attention being paid to this now, though I still think it's really primitive stuff. I can do it on a personal level. I'll give you a very personal example. My wife and I needed something, there was sort of a medical thing that we needed to deal with. And the first group of physicians we went to evaluate that couldn't answer a bunch of questions I had. Questions that they clearly didn't get normally answered. They didn't normally get asked. And that just immediately told me, like, I don't want to be treated by these people. So we switched to another doctor, and she was able to answer every question. I didn't like all the answers, by the way, but at least she could answer every question. To me, that's a start, right? It's sort of, and so actually, it's funny, I thought about it after. I almost wanted to make an app that could give similar patients, like at least the question list to ask. So maybe part of the solution is anytime you go into a dentist or your doctor or your surgeon or whatever, there's a checklist that you have as the patient that says, hang on a second, I know you want to pop off all my fillings and make them nice and white again. May I ask you these 3 questions or these 10 questions? And some of them are general questions, but some of them have to be very specific to your practice. How many times do you do this procedure? I was shocked to learn today when we were walking down here that you guys, as a group, do a fraction of the root canals in this country. That's kind of strange to me.
Most of us only do root canals that have already been done before. In other words, most of us, we never get the patient initially. They've already had a root canal by the time they come to our office.
So to me, that's like really strange. Couldn't you save a lot of time, money, and suffering if, and again, maybe it's not structurally possible, maybe there aren't enough of you to handle every root canal, but you could, maybe there's a way to stratify patients better so that only the most easy root canal can be done by the guy who's going to do 5 a month, and then the hard ones go to you guys who can do 5 a day. But you make, so I think part of it just comes down to, almost standardizing and automating a set of questions, both about the general topic and then secondly about the provider's specific experience. I think you'd have to come up with a way to create an algorithm around it, because not everybody understands Bayesian statistics, not everybody understands what the answers mean, but I think that's not a problem I can devote my life to just because I've got a few other things on the go, but I would really hope that people on that side of that discussion are working on those sorts of tools for patients.
Do you have any hope that this catastrophic problem could be fixed unless the U.S. tax code is overhauled in a major way? Short of that, I don't think it's feasible.
I think you're probably right, and I think the good thing about an overhaul of the U.S. tax code is I think it would fix a lot of other structural problems that might not be first in line, but could be third, fourth, and fifth in line. I have pretty radical views on tax, personally. Just to be blunt, since you guys can yell at me if you want. I actually think we should have a flat tax. So I'm a huge proponent of flat tax. But, you know, and I've talked to like people who can explain this up the wazoo, and I've asked them a simple question, which is, like, you only need to spend an hour with somebody really explaining why a flat tax would fix so many problems to have them come away going, yep, that makes sense. And then the question is, why can't it happen? And tragically, it's really a lobbying problem. I mean, there's a lot of people that don't have a job if you have a flat tax, if you simplified our tax code. Interestingly, by the way, Gary Taubes, my co-founder, asked John Ioannidis a couple of years ago, he said, why do we have epidemiologists anymore? Like, why do we have an epidemiologist in nutrition anymore? You know what I mean? Like, why do we have an entire group of people who just churn out sort of meaningless correlations all day long? And John said, well, there's 14,000 epidemiologists in the United States. And Gary said, yeah, my question still stands. And he goes, what do you want them all to do? And it's sort of like, I don't care. Like, get another goddamn job, but stop doing things that are harmful. And it's the sort of the same thing. Like, I mean, so yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if we could overhaul the tax code, I think we'd fix a whole bunch of problems.
What about all the end-of-life issues? Because we spend a lot of money.
So that also seems to be a pretty interesting U.S. problem. I think it fits under the skin in the game thing. So again, I can share with you several anecdotes, right? So you know how I said the culture of the U.S. is a litigious culture? Like, we just love suing people. I think there's also this other component to our culture, and I feel I'm probably just as guilty of it, which is we really love to extend life. Like, we somehow view the number of years lived as the benchmark. Like, if you make it to 86, even if the last 16 years are horrible, you made it to 86, right? And I think about that a lot, but I think that's actually very different from other countries I've been to. I've traveled a lot, and I've interacted with healthcare providers and patients in other countries. And I grew up in another country. It's very different in other countries. Ironically, many of them look to the U.S. and want to emulate us. That's the irony of it. But they've also wanted to emulate us with food, and look where that's taken them. So I think this is there are structural fixes to that. So the example is the QALY. So the UK has a structural fix to all of this. It sounds draconian to us, but it's called a quality adjusted life year, which is an equation. The equation says the maximum amount reimbursable by the NHS is £100,000 per QALY, quality adjusted life year. I'll give you an example. If a person has metastatic colon cancer and they want Avastin, which is the big blockbuster drug in the United States, Avastin will extend your life with metastatic cancer by 4 months. It costs $100,000. Ergo, the NHS will not pay for it. They are putting a dollar value on life. It's $100,000 a year. Some payers will do it, most will not. So today, now in the UK there's a way around it, which I think is a great system, which is you can buy private insurance, supplemental insurance, where you're going to pay a much higher premium, but it says, look, if God forbid someone in my family gets cancer, I want the $100,000 treatment that's going to extend my life 4 months. But there it's a privilege and not a right. And so that's part of it. But part of it, I mean, we have to be careful about how much of this is cultural and how much of this is structural. I just think culturally, a patient that walks in with a descending aortic aneurysm who's 80 years old to a hospital in the UK or Canada, nobody expects heroic efforts. Like, whereas in the United States, we routinely do $1 million operations on those people, only to watch them go from the OR to the ICU, live on dialysis for a month with renal failure after their kidneys dissected, and die. I mean, that's pretty much what always happens. But the family insists, and that's part of this culture of like, I really want my father, my mother to have another month of life. They don't think they're only buying a month of life. They believe in sort of the dream, which is, in many ways, we're a victim of our own success because we have the best healthcare system in terms of quality and heroics in these things. I think we're becoming victims of that because there's this belief that the extension of life is something we can do. So again, there's no easy answer. I think the answer to that is partly a cultural shift, which comes, again, you do that by shifting the cost burden a little bit. And secondly, there's also, there are some structural changes you can put in place.
What do you think of the prospects? Competition in the marketplace is a good thing. When insurance, medical insurance becomes more portable so that you can get tertiary care, let's say in the Far East, where care is good, or Canada or somewhere else, that's going to foment competition and keep costs domestically lower. What are your thoughts about that?
So so the only way you can create that incentive is you have to be passing the cost on to the patient, right? So if you're sitting here in San Diego and you need a hip replacement, and you're even entertaining medical tourism, right? I'm going to go over to Singapore, where I know I can get a knee replaced for 1/3 the cost. I mean, the only way you're doing that is if you're bearing a significant portion of that cost. So I do think that that's an interesting model. I do think that it could introduce competition domestically. I think the other thing to keep in mind with all of this is that, and you brought this up though indirectly, is the portability of healthcare creates a little bit of an incentive problem that I didn't get into here. So if you are 30 years old, if you're 36, go back to me 5 years ago. So if you were me 5 years ago, the pre-diabetic chubby guy who has a 8.9% Framingham risk of an MI in the next 10 years, and you're my employer, and you're paying my insurance, should you care? The answer is no. Do you know why? The probability that I'm going to be your employee in 10 years is very low. It's a hot potato game too. So again, we're going from the complicated to the uber complicated. But the problem is the only time an employer really cares about your cost is when you're old, right? Because the young invincibles don't really chew up healthcare dollars. So if there's a pension component to it, you know, like you got the guys on the C-suite that you basically own their health insurance cost for life. Yeah, you care about them. Or if you believe that this is an employer, you know, if you have the type of a company where, you know, your employer is going to stay with you forever, there you have an incentive. But it is in fact this portability of healthcare that I think makes it a little challenging. It's like playing a game of, what's the game you play when you go around the circle with one chair short and when the music stops you have to sit down? Yeah, musical chair. It's a little bit of a musical chairs past the hot potato game of the, like, all I really got to do is make sure that my high risk employees, I want to identify them and come up with ways to make sure they don't get into trouble, but I really don't care about true prevention. It's a subtle distinction, but whereas a national system actually does have incentive to care about prevention because they own the rent no matter what. You know, if you're 14 today and you've got fatty liver disease because you drink 6 Coca-Colas a day, that's going to be my problem at some point. Might not be my problem for 5 years. It's going to be my problem at some point. So again, if I was God for a day, I would somehow figure out a way to put in the system a little bit of risk ownership over a time horizon as well.
One of the things that hasn't been mentioned today was wait times. I live in Ontario.
Yeah.
I've lived there my whole life. I've hardly paid a dime out of my own pocket for medical care. But you'll wait a year to see a neurologist. My mom waited 1.5 years to get her knee replaced. My dad had a stroke. He waited 14 hours in an emergency room, and we left without seeing a neurologist. Those are the kind of issues that you're faced with that kind of system.
Yeah, no, and to be clear, there is no system out there right now that works, right? Like if you said to me, pick a system you got to have right now, it's ours, which sucks. But what I'm saying is there are elements of these other systems that matter. So you're absolutely correct. And look, I think it's actually easier to fix the Canadian system and the UK system than it is ours. Because I think what you would do in your system is you bolt on supplemental insurance programs that basically you almost, I mean, and again, from a Canadian ethos standpoint, that's awful, right? Because as Canadians, you're also polite and God forbid you could pay to move up in the line, but you can't have your cake and eat it too. Either we truly all have to wait 14 hours, or we do allow some people to say, look, everybody will get health care, and you will get your MRI in a year, but if you want to have your MRI tomorrow, it's going to cost you $5,000 a year.
The challenge with that is, and politicians do this privately all the time, they'll take care of their own family, but politically they won't come out and say that.
Absolutely not. And my brother lives in Ottawa. My parents are still in Toronto. I'm well familiar with that. And you're right. I think that's a cultural issue in Canada, right? We don't have a hard time with that in the United States. So, like I said, there's no perfect system. I think that the ideal system takes elements of every system in place, some more than others. But again, the fundamental problem, Canada suffers from one problem that the US does just as much, which is you guys also don't carry the risk. And so, to me, that's the single most important change that has to happen. You must transfer risk to the person consuming the service.
Have you given this lecture to politicians in the U.S.?
I haven't. No.
You need to.
Yeah.
You're not going to be invited?
I don't think they care. I mean, to be honest with you, remember, again, we want to talk about incentive. Remember how I said the incentive of most people doing research today is to get the grant, not to make the scientific breakthrough? What's the incentive of a politician? It's to be elected or stay in office. Look, they care about these other things softly. If you could get elected, stay in office, and do good, that's great. But you must stay elected and stay in office, right? So I'm not sure they need more pressure.